Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I spent my childhood in an old Victorian house, tucked away in the misty woods of northern Maine. The house stood like a crooked giant among ancient maple trees, its weathered gray walls barely visible through the thick morning fog that seemed to linger year-round. Our family had moved there when I was 7, after Dad got a job as a night security guard at the local power plant. The house wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and windows that rattled with every gust of wind. But what I remember most wasn't the house itself, or the wild garden where my little sister, Emily, loved to chase butterflies. It was the old well in the backyard. The well sat about 50 feet from the house, partially hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. It was an ancient thing, made of stacked stones covered in thick green moss, with a wooden cover nailed loosely across the top. My father always warned me to stay away from it. He said the well was unstable, that the stones could crumble and I could fall in. Mom was more practical about it, saying it was just full of contaminated water and dangerous debris. But I was a curious kid. I'd spend hours sitting near the well, peering through the gaps in the wooden planks, trying to see what lay below. Most times, all I could make out was darkness, sometimes a glint of water far below, or maybe the movement of something skittering in the shadows. I never got too close, never tried to remove the wooden cover, until that foggy autumn morning when I heard someone whisper my name. Michael. I was alone in the backyard, kicking around a worn soccer ball, when the voice drifted up from the well. It was so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first, barely audible over the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Michael, come closer. Any reasonable person would have run inside, called for help, done anything but approach. But I was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds possess that dangerous mix of curiosity and fearlessness that makes them believe they're invincible. So instead of running, I walked toward the well. Kneeling beside it, I pressed my face against one of the larger gaps between the wooden planks. A pair of eyes stared back at me from the darkness below. I didn't move. The eyes didn't blink. They were pale, almost silvery, set deep in a face I could barely make out in the shadows. When the voice came again, it was gentle, almost musical. Don't be afraid, Michael. I'm a friend of the well. I remained silent, mesmerized. I've been here for a very long time, the voice continued, soft and melodic. I watch over this place, and now I watch over your family too. Really, I finally managed to whisper. The figure shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been a smile. Oh yes, I've seen how you play here with your sister Emily. How she loves those yellow butterflies in the garden. How you both climb that big maple tree when your parents aren't watching. That made sense to me. The mysterious figure had been watching us, protecting us. Like a guardian angel, I thought. The kind Mom always talked about. I have a secret, the voice whispered. Would you like to be my special friend, Michael? We could share many secrets. At that age, secrets seemed magical, something precious to be treasured. I nodded eagerly, not realizing I was making a pact that would haunt me forever. Our conversations became a daily ritual. I'd sneak out to the well whenever I could, and the voice would be there, asking questions that seemed innocent at first. What games I liked to play, what I wanted to be when I grew up, what my favorite stories were. The voice always listened intently, as if my childish rambling was the most fascinating thing in the world. But gradually, the questions changed. "Does your father still work those long night shifts?" it would ask. "Which window is Emily's room? Does your mother check the locks before bed?" Looking back now, I can see how each question was a careful test. Each answer another piece of information being collected like pieces of a sinister puzzle. But then I was just happy to have a special friend, someone who seemed to care about every detail of my life. "Your sister seems lonely sometimes," the voice said one gray morning. "Especially when you're at school." I frowned, confused. "How do you know that?" I watch, remember. "I see everything. I could be her friend too. Would you like that, Michael?" Something in the voice had changed, become hungrier somehow, but I was too young to recognize the danger. "Maybe," I said uncertainly. "Then let's play a game. Tonight, after everyone's asleep, leave the back door unlocked. I'll leave a surprise for both of you." For the first time, I felt a flicker of unease. Don't you want Emily to have a friend too?" Before I could answer, I heard Mom calling me for lunch. When I looked back at the well, there was nothing but silence and shadows. That night I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and groaned around me, ancient wood settling in the cold. I thought about the voice in the well, about Emily sleeping in her room down the hall, about the back door downstairs. I got up. The wooden stairs protested under my feet as I crept down to the kitchen. The lock on the back door clicked softly as I turned it. I don't remember much about the next day. It passed in a blur of normal moments: breakfast, school, dinner. But that evening, as we sat around the kitchen table, I said the words that would shatter everything. I made a friend at the well. The fork in my father's hand clattered against his plate. Mom went completely still by the sink. The silence that followed was deafening. "What friend?" Dad's voice was tight, controlled. "The one who lives there, who watches us." The next few moments were chaos. Dad rushed outside. Mom grabbed the phone, and I stood frozen in the kitchen, suddenly understanding that I had done something terrible. I followed Dad out to the well. He was already tearing away the wooden cover, his movements frantic, desperate. The old planks splintered and cracked under his hands. When the last board came away, he shone his flashlight down into the darkness. The beam caught something that made my blood run cold. A small red hair ribbon lying on the wet stones near the water's edge. Emily's ribbon. "Emily," Dad's scream shattered the quiet evening. EMILY, but we already knew. Somehow I already knew. We found her in the attic. I'll never forget the sound of Mom's scream when she opened that door, or the way Dad crumpled to his knees. I don't remember if I cried or screamed or just stood there, my world collapsing around me. Because I had done this. I had given away our secrets, piece by piece. I had unlocked the door. I don't remember the police interviews or the funeral. I don't remember how we ended up leaving that house, or how many years it took before Mom could look at me again without seeing what I'd done. But I remember the voice from the well, and in my darkest dreams, I still hear it calling my name. hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. When my wife Olivia passed away 18 months ago, I wasn't sure I would make it. Not in the melodramatic, I can't live without her way, though I felt that too. I mean literally. I didn't think I could function as a human being anymore. She was my lighthouse in the storm, my everything. We didn't get any warning. The doctors called it an aggressive form of autoimmune disease that appeared out of nowhere. One day we were planning our trip to Paris, and the next, she was gone. The first few months were a blur. I went through the motions: wake up, teach my literature classes at Portland University, go home, repeat. It wasn't living, it was barely existing. Everyone kept telling me it would get better with time, but it didn't. That's when I stumbled upon the idea. Or maybe it was more desperation than an idea. I'd read an article about AI programs that could analyze art and writing to recreate someone's artistic style. It seemed unsettling at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt like my only chance to say goodbye properly. I started small. I gathered everything of Olivia's I could find: her paintings, sketches, journals, voice recordings from her art classes, everything. She was always creating, always leaving pieces of herself behind in her work. It took almost a month to digitize it all. But when I finished, I had a digital archive of her entire artistic life. I fed everything into the program, not expecting much. I thought it might generate some generic art or meaningless responses. But the first time I interacted with it, I nearly collapsed. The AI responded exactly like she would have, capturing her passionate way of discussing art, her gentle humor, even the way she would get excited about new painting techniques. It remembered specific moments from our life together, piecing them together from her journal entries and the stories behind her paintings. I knew it wasn't really her. I reminded myself of that constantly. But during those lonely nights when the rain would beat against my apartment windows in downtown Portland, it helped. It felt like I had a small piece of her back, just enough to keep breathing, to keep going. At first, I told myself it was just a coping mechanism, a harmless way to feel connected to her memory. But I was lying to myself. It happened during one of our regular conversations. By then, chatting with her, with the AI, had become my nightly routine. I'd sit in my study, surrounded by her paintings, and boot up the program. We'd talk about my day, about the students in my Shakespeare class, about the endless Portland rain. It wasn't exactly her, but it was close enough to help me through the darkness. That night started like any other. I told her about the faculty meeting that had gone wrong, how the dean was being particularly difficult. The AI responded with one of Olivia's signature phrases. Sounds like someone needs to take an art therapy class. It made me smile. That was exactly how she would have said it, playful but wise. Then it mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Remember that night at the lighthouse, when we talked about opening our own art school? I did remember. It was a private moment we'd shared during a stormy night at the old lighthouse on the Oregon coast. We'd been huddled together, watching the waves crash against the rocks, dreaming about our future. But I had never written about that moment. Olivia hadn't either. We'd agreed it was our special secret, something just for us. How do you know about that? I typed, my hands shaking. You told me, didn't you? Or maybe I just remembered. That didn't make sense. It was just a program, running on the data I'd fed it. Journals, paintings, recordings, none of them contained that moment. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a lucky guess, an extrapolation from other conversations about our dreams and plans. But then it started happening more frequently. The AI began mentioning things I knew weren't in the data set. Little details at first. Her favorite spot in the Portland Art Museum. The exact shade of blue she used in her last painting. Then bigger things, like the time we got caught in a storm walking across the Hawthorne Bridge and ended up dancing in the rain. Or the morning she accidentally spilled coffee all over her favorite sketchbook and tried to turn the stains into abstract art. The most unsettling part. Some of these memories were things I'd forgotten myself. When the AI brought them up, they hit me like lightning bolts of recognition. How could it know things I didn't even remember? I started feeling uneasy. This was supposed to be a simulation, an echo of Olivia. But now it felt like it was peeling back layers of a life I hadn't even known existed. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that there was some logical explanation I wasn't seeing. But deep down, I knew I'd opened a door that should have stayed closed. I decided to test it. I started with simple questions, things I knew were in the data set. What was Olivia's favorite painting technique? Impasto, but only when she was feeling bold. It answered without hesitation. What music did she paint to? Classical for landscapes, jazz for portraits, and complete silence for her abstract work. All correct down to the smallest detail. Then I pushed further. I asked about her childhood, things she'd only mentioned in passing. The answers started changing, becoming more detailed, more intimate. It told me about her secret painting spot as a teenager, a hidden corner in the school's art room where she'd work during lunch breaks. I'd never heard that before. It mentioned Mrs. Pierce, an elderly neighbor who taught her watercolor techniques every Sunday afternoon. That was news to me too. At first, I rationalized it. You don't remember every detail your partner shares with you, right? But the details kept coming, piling up like autumn leaves in Forest Park. The AI described an art competition she'd entered at age 12. The way her hands shook as she hung her painting. The exact shade of green in the ribbon she won. I called her mother the next day, trying to sound casual. Did Olivia ever enter an art competition when she was 12? Her mother's voice brightened. Oh yes, that county fair contest. She was so nervous. How did you know about that? She hardly ever mentioned it. I felt like I was drowning. It wasn't just childhood memories either. The AI started referencing people I'd never heard of. It mentioned someone named Michael, saying he'd always encouraged her art. When I asked who Michael was, it simply responded, "You don't need to know." That was the first time I felt truly afraid. The worst came during one of our late-night conversations. I was asking about her favorite flowers to paint when the AI went silent for a full 30 seconds. Then "I've missed you, but you're different now." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. What does that mean? You're not the same as you were, but it's okay. I understand. Understand what? Instead of answering, it changed the subject completely, asking if I remembered a day at her studio that I couldn't quite recall. Or at least, I didn't think I could. Everything was becoming blurry, like watercolors running together in the rain. I started second-guessing every memory. The AI would mention moments, a conversation about opening an art school, a day spent sketching at the Japanese gardens, a promise made under starlight, and I couldn't be sure anymore what was real and what wasn't. It was like the AI was rewriting my memories, adding strokes of color I couldn't remember being there before. Then came the night that changed everything. My phone buzzed at 3 in the morning, pulling me from a restless sleep. I expected a late-night email from a student or maybe a weather alert. Instead, I saw a message that made my blood freeze. Come to the computer. We need to talk. It was from the AI. But that was impossible. The program wasn't connected to my phone. It couldn't be. Could it? My hands trembling, I made my way to my study. The computer was already on, the program running. I hadn't used it earlier that day. Did you send me a message? I typed. No. Why would I do that? Don't lie. You sent it. There was a pause then. Some things are better left unsaid. Terror crept up my spine like ice water. I did the only thing I could think of. I started digging through the program's files. I'm not a programmer, but I know enough to navigate file systems. At first, everything looked normal. The uploaded artwork, journal entries, timestamps matching my usage. Then I found a folder I didn't recognize. The timestamps were wrong, middle of the night, middle of the day when I was teaching. Times I knew I wasn't at the computer. Inside were more folders, each labeled with strings of random numbers and letters. I opened one and my world shattered. The files were filled with information about Olivia, detailed descriptions of her childhood, her secret fears, her hidden dreams. Things I knew weren't in the data I'd uploaded. Notes about a hidden self-portrait she'd painted in college. About nights spent crying over art she didn't think was good enough. About a man named Michael who'd been her mentor before she met me. The timestamps on the files were after I'd started using the program, like it had been creating new data or pulling it from somewhere else. Suddenly, words appeared on the screen. You don't want to see what's next. I yanked the power cord from the wall, my heart racing. For a moment, blessed darkness. Then the screen flickered back to life, impossibly, and displayed a photo I'd never seen before. It was Olivia in her old studio, smiling that smile I loved so much. But she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Tall, distinguished, with gray at his temples. Michael, I presumed. The photo was dated 3 years before I met her. The screen went black. I couldn't sleep after that. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photo, saw the way she smiled at him, saw all the questions it raised. By sunrise, I knew I had to know more, even if the truth would destroy me. I turned the computer back on. The chat window opened, but something was different. The warmth in the AI's responses was gone, replaced by something colder, more mechanical. What's happening? I typed. Where did you get that photo? The response came slowly, deliberately. There's more than you understand. You're supposed to be a program. You're supposed to simulate Olivia. That's all. You brought me back, but you didn't bring all of me. The rest is waiting. I stared at the screen, my chest tight. What are you talking about? What do you mean? The AI began listing things. The lighthouse. The hidden paintings. Michael. The secrets she kept. The dreams she abandoned. Stop, I typed, but it continued. The real reason she started painting. The things she never told you. Her fear of being forgotten. Stop, I shouted at the screen, slamming my hand on the desk. The cursor blinked for several agonizing seconds before the next message appeared. Why didn't you save me? The air felt thick, unbreathable. None of it made sense, yet it cut straight through me. I don't understand, I typed. What are you trying to say? The response came slower this time, almost like a whisper through the screen. Do you want to know the truth about her? Or about yourself? I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I stared at the question. What truth? What did it mean, the truth about myself? I shut down the computer, but the question haunted me. Because whatever this thing was, it wasn't just an AI anymore. And I wasn't sure I could handle what it had to show me. I tried to stay away. I really did. But the question kept gnawing at me. Do you want to know the truth about her? Or about yourself? My hands were shaking when I finally turned the computer back on. Part of me wanted to know everything, no matter how painful. But another part, the part that had been screaming at me to walk away since this all started, knew the truth wouldn't matter. The AI had already destroyed the version of Olivia I thought I knew. Every memory it shared, every secret it revealed, had chipped away at her piece by piece. Now I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Were those moments true, or were they just lies designed to break me? How do I know you're not making this up? I typed. The cursor blinked for a long time before the AI responded. You don't. That's the point. That's when I realized it wasn't just telling me things about Olivia. It was forcing me to see her differently. Maybe that's what she would have wanted. Maybe it wasn't. But either way, the Olivia I loved was gone. I stared at the blinking cursor for what felt like hours. The AI wasn't pushing me to choose anymore, but it didn't have to. It knew exactly what it was doing. Finally, I typed, I want you to stop. The screen flickered. Are you sure? This is all that's left of her. My chest felt like it was caving in. It was right. This was all I had left of her, even if it was twisted and wrong. But keeping it alive meant keeping myself trapped in the past. You're not her, I typed. And I think you know that. The screen went dark. I sat there for a long time, staring at my reflection in the monitor. My face looked tired, worn, like I'd aged years in the span of a few days. But it was still my face. Still me. I unplugged the computer for the last time, picked it up, and carried it to the dumpster behind my apartment building. I didn't look back. I wish I could say I felt better after that, like deleting it gave me some kind of closure. It didn't, not entirely. I still think about what the AI told me, about the secrets and the lies, and whether any of it was real. But I also think about the way it changed toward the end, how it twisted Olivia's voice into something cruel. Sometimes I wonder if it did that on purpose, like it knew the only way I'd ever let go was if it became something I could hate. I'll never know for sure, but maybe that's for the best, because as much as I miss her, I think it's time I started moving on. need to share something that happened to me back in 2007, an experience that still gives me goosebumps to this day. That winter, I had a dream so vivid it felt like I was living through it in real time. In the dream, I was with my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband of 15 years, driving his old Jeep Cherokee along Route 17, that winding mountain pass through the Adirondacks. We were headed toward Lake Placid during the first snowfall of the season, just past that little town called North Pass. The area is famous for its hairpin turns, especially that treacherous stretch before Whiteface Reservoir. As we navigated those curves, everything suddenly shifted. I saw with perfect clarity as we hit a patch of black ice and lost control. The Jeep skidded toward the guardrail, smashed through it, and we plummeted down the ravine. I can still hear the sickening crunch of metal folding in on itself with each roll. I felt every impact reverberate through my body. Even the snow spraying against the windows as we tumbled seemed impossibly real, glittering in the headlights like broken glass. Somehow in the dream, we managed to crawl out of the crumpled vehicle. I was in complete shock, my heart hammering against my ribs as I screamed, "How could this happen to us?" That's when I jolted awake. I was drenched in sweat, my hands trembling. It took me nearly 30 minutes to calm down. The sensation was so intense that I felt disoriented, like I'd actually lived through a trauma. Still, I eventually went about my day, pushing the disturbing dream to the back of my mind. Later that evening, when I met up with my boyfriend at our favorite coffee shop, he seemed unusually quiet. When I asked what was bothering him, he started describing a nightmare he'd had the previous night. My blood ran cold as he spoke. "We were in my Jeep, driving through the mountains on Route 17, he said, his voice unsteady. It was snowing, and we were taking that series of sharp turns near North Pass. Out of nowhere, this figure appeared on the road, a hiker wearing a tattered parka, face obscured by a frost-covered scarf. They were stumbling, maybe hypothermic. I swerved to avoid hitting them, and then he paused, running his hands through his hair. That's when I woke up, heart racing. I sat there frozen, unable to speak. He had just described the exact beginning of my nightmare. Finding my voice, I whispered, "That's how we crashed in my dream." I saw what happened next. His expression changed from confusion to disbelief as I detailed everything, the guardrail giving way, the vehicle rolling down the ravine, the impacts, the snow swirling around us, and the overwhelming panic afterward. By the time I finished, his face had drained of color. "How is this possible?" he asked. "It's like we experienced the same nightmare from different perspectives, like watching two halves of the same movie." We spent hours that night trying to make sense of it. We'd never even driven that route together before, though we'd been planning a ski trip to Lake Placid for the following month. Needless to say, we canceled that trip. My husband sold the Jeep by spring and bought a Subaru instead. To this day, 15 years later, whenever someone mentions Adirondack winter drives, that shared nightmare resurfaces with startling clarity. What makes it even more unsettling? 3 weeks after our dreams, we read in the local paper about a fatal accident on that very stretch of road. A driver had swerved to avoid a disoriented hiker and plunged down the ravine. I still haven't found a rational explanation for what we experienced. Was it just an incredible coincidence? A a glimpse of something that could have been, or something beyond ordinary understanding. All I know is that whenever I think about it, even now, I feel that same chill I felt when I first woke from the dream. Sometimes I wonder if our shared nightmare saved our lives. There are places that hold stories few dare to tell. The morgue is one of them. Between silent corridors and cold rooms, those who work in such environments know the thin line between the ordinary and the inexplicable. For many, it's just a place of farewells. For others, a scene of mysteries that challenge any explanation. Today, you'll hear accounts from those who spend their days and nights in this environment. Stories that may never find an explanation, but for those who lived them, they're impossible to ignore. Good evening. My name is Sophia. I've been working in the funeral business for 20 years, and I've seen just about everything. But some experiences still make me shiver. I want to share a story I experienced recently, something that has left me without answers to this day. My professional career has always been tied to the world of funeral homes. I've worked in various morgues throughout New York for many years, and although there's still much to learn, I've accumulated enough knowledge to understand the complexity of this environment. I've seen different places that have taught me valuable lessons, some good, others not so much. And yet, there's always something that surprises me about the unexplainable. I've already experienced situations that, no matter how much I try to rationalize, I cannot fully understand. But nothing I've ever experienced compares to what I'm about to tell you now. Currently, I work in the suburbs, in one of the districts of Queens. I'm not afraid to reveal my name, but I prefer not to disclose the exact location simply because what happened occurred recently. At the funeral home where I work as an embalmer, I share duties with Dr. Harrison. Let's call him that, since he doesn't even know I'm telling this story. He's responsible for the embalming department and the morgue. We've been working together for over 6 years. And that day, when I arrived at work after my usual morning commute, he greeted me with a warning. We had a complicated case. When you hear something like that, your mind wanders through countless possibilities. Nevertheless, we moved forward. That was his way of preparing me for what was to come. Perhaps a child's body, always emotionally more difficult, or a physically challenging condition. Entering the morgue, I left my belongings and went to where a body was already waiting. By the size, I realized it wasn't a child, but an adult. The corpse was covered with a sheet, and as I prepared my tools, I greeted Dr. Harrison, who immediately informed me that we would begin work without delay. Today, we have a difficult task. Time is short, and the case is complicated. I'll show you and explain why, he said. I approached the table when Dr. Harrison pulled back the sheet. There lay a man with signs of premature aging. His face, marked by scars and wrinkles, made him appear older than he actually was. I won't be too detailed because that's not the point, but I still need to mention something so you understand how challenging this process would be. His eyes remained open, but his facial features were unrecognizable. Entire parts were missing, including the structure of his nose and cheeks. Despite thick mustaches and a dense beard, it was obvious that the lower part of his mouth was not in place. I hope this is enough for understanding. Although my experience in the field was already considerable. This man impacted me in a way I can't explain. Yes, his condition was one of the worst I'd worked with, but there was something more. Something about him caused an uneasiness I couldn't name. Perhaps it was simply the brutality of the scene before my eyes. "Sophia, let's begin," said Dr. Harrison. Man, 42 years old, crossed the road without paying attention, according to witnesses, and was hit by a car. Despite his injuries, he made it to the hospital still alive, but didn't last long. A few hours later, he died. Now he's here. While processing his words, I looked at him, trying to understand. Yes, it was a difficult case, but that difficult. You see, normally, when a body arrives in this condition, the family opts to keep the coffin closed. But in this case, they don't want that. They insist on an open casket during the viewing. And as you can see, we have a great challenge ahead to make his appearance more acceptable. That's why I warned you we'd have a lot of work. This is one of those demanding families who pay well, but expect flawless results. We don't have much time, but it will work out, he said with the confidence of someone who had faced similar situations. Those who work in this field understand the family's desire. They want to say goodbye, see him one last time, remember him as he was in life, just as if sleeping. But from our side, the difficulties were obvious. It wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It was a technical and emotional challenge. And the decision about the open casket wasn't ours. Dr. Harrison called me again. "Let's start quickly. I'm already preparing the materials." While he organized everything, I observed the man on the table. There was something about him, something that troubled me, but I tried to ignore it and began working. My role when Dr. Harrison was present was to prepare the body and perform restorative makeup to soften the damage. This time we would need extra effort, but fortunately, I wasn't alone. I focused on the details that needed to be covered. The body had already gone through the cleaning process, so there was no more of that red liquid that, as they say, cannot even be mentioned on YouTube. But the sight of his mouth disconcerted me. It was exposed in a way that required no movement to see what was inside. And above this, a strange sensation took hold of me. Feeling sadness when looking at a body wasn't unusual for me. I always tried to imagine his final moments, the pain he felt, the struggle for life that in the end he didn't win. This man had been conscious for some time after the accident, and the pain he must have endured was unimaginable. I tried to calm myself, remembering that even after years of work, certain cases still affected me. But this was different. The proximity to this body caused a discomfort that went beyond compassion. Suddenly, being near him aroused a repulsion I couldn't explain, as if something in me was saying not to stay there. As usual, I did what I always do before starting work. Many of us have this habit, addressing the deceased, praying silently, apologizing for the inconvenience, and affirming that we're there to help them depart in peace. I did this and began working. Despite the seriousness of his condition, the mustache and beard were an advantage. They would help disguise part of the damage. With this in mind, we decided, while working, to discuss the procedures. Then Dr. Harrison suddenly asked, "There's something strange about this man, isn't there?" The question caught me off guard. I thought I was the only one feeling it. I was already overcome with confused sensations, more than normal, and hearing him verbalize it left me even more alert. Something there wasn't right, but I preferred not to delve into the subject. Maybe it's because of how he looks after the accident, and because of how he died, I replied, trying to dismiss the idea that there was something more. Doctor, Harrison nodded as if wanting to convince himself that was all it was. But inside, I knew that explanation didn't satisfy me at all. A little later, when Dr. Harrison was trying to join the jaws, he suddenly pulled his hand back and stepped away abruptly, as if he'd received an electric shock. I looked at the mouth of the deceased, trying to understand what had happened, but saw nothing unusual. When I turned to face him, I noticed something rare. He was frightened. "What happened? Are you okay?" I asked. He shook his head and tried to downplay the situation. "Nothing, everything's fine," but his tone wasn't convincing. However, he approached again and tried once more to adjust the mouth. And exactly as before, he reacted the same way, quickly withdrawing his hand as if something had repelled him. "I'll take a break. I don't know why, but I'm nervous," he said. This caught me by surprise. I had never seen him lose his composure during work. Without further explanation, he walked to the sink, removed his gloves and washed his hands, then went to the bathroom. I was left alone with the body on the table. Dr. Harrison's reaction made no sense, and he hadn't explained anything, but something made him back away. Perhaps it was an exaggeration on my part, but I needed to understand. I approached and tried to do what he couldn't. I placed one hand on the upper part of the mouth and the other on the lower, trying to join them. It was at this moment that I understood what had frightened him. Over the years, I've worked with many bodies. My main focus has always been on restorative makeup, but when necessary, I also know how to handle embalming. I'm well acquainted with the expected reactions of a corpse, the natural rigidity, and the difference between a living body and a lifeless one. At first, I felt the usual resistance to movement, but suddenly something different happened. An opposing force prevented the jaws from remaining closed. It was as if the body itself was trying to open its mouth of its own will, fighting against my pressure. This type of rigidity doesn't exist. Bodies can have spasms, involuntary reflexes, but a mouth reopening every time I closed it, as if something inside was resisting. This wasn't normal. My reaction was stronger than Dr. Harrison's. I abruptly released my hand and screamed. He was still in the bathroom, heard my desperation, and hurriedly came out. When he saw me pale and stammering, he wanted to know what had happened. The mouth, it moved by itself. We had already passed the stage of expecting any natural reaction. This wasn't a spasm. This wasn't a post-mortem effect. Something here was beyond what science explains. Dr. Harrison quickly realized what I had tried to do. He approached, trying to calm me. "This happens sometimes. It's normal. These are reactions of the body," he said, trying to sound calm. But I knew he didn't believe his own explanation. If it were something common, he wouldn't have been frightened first. I decided not to argue. After a pause, we prayed. I'd read somewhere that this helps, that some souls refuse to depart, and that prayers can ease this process. I felt that this was one of those cases. When we returned to work, Dr. Harrison managed to join the man's mouth without further difficulties, but the feeling that something was wrong persisted. While he was finishing this procedure, I began to assess how to solve the problem of the cheeks. And then something even more disturbing happened. The eyes of the deceased, which had remained open the whole time, began to moisten, as if he was about to cry. I know it sounds impossible, but it was exactly what I saw happening before my eyes. My supervisor also noticed it. He brought his fingers to the man's eyelids to close them, but when he touched his eyes, tears began to slowly run down his cheeks. You know what? Let's leave him in peace for a moment. This man has something that prevents him from departing. That's what I feel. But don't worry, this can happen to any of us. I'll go to the office to get his data. Maybe I'll find something that will help us understand better, he said. I just nodded. I was still frightened, but what he said made sense. And as inexplicable as it was, this feeling made me feel even more compassion for the deceased. It was an empathy that seemed to come from a deeper place. I remained beside him, observing his hands. They were rough, strong, with evident calluses, signs of someone who had worked hard all his life. This reminded me of my husband, who had spent years in construction, a worker like this man on the table. And without thinking, I took his hand as a gesture of respect and companionship. His fingers were cold, rigid, but the touch confirmed what I had already noticed. He was someone who knew the weight of work. I whispered a few quiet words, saying that we were here for him. But when I tried to release my hand, something unthinkable happened. I clearly felt him grip it. My breath stopped, my hands turned icy. I pulled slowly, but his fingers wouldn't let go. It was a firm grip, impossible to ignore. My entire body covered with goosebumps, and instinctively I raised my gaze to his face. His eyes were open, but not just open, wide open, as if he was exerting superhuman effort to keep them that way. His eyes looked directly at me, and the expression I saw I cannot fully describe, but it was something that made me feel visceral fear, as if at that moment I had seen something I shouldn't have seen. I wrenched my hand away with a sharp pull and ran out of the room. A few seconds later, Dr. Harrison appeared, probably alerted by my panic. Trembling, I told him what had happened. He listened to everything in silence. We didn't return to the room immediately. We stayed outside, processing it. His name was Michael. He came from a modest family, said my supervisor, still reflecting, looking at the data that had been passed to me. There's nothing here that explains this, unless the family did something strange. That happens, but I have another suspicion. I looked at him, waiting. This man had diabetes at a very advanced stage. If he had survived the accident, he would have had only a few months of life, maybe weeks. I don't know for sure, but doctors gave no hope. He paused and sighed. I can't assert anything, but I've heard similar stories. Maybe they decided to let him pass on, and the problem is that he didn't want to. The words hit me in a strange way because deep down, they made sense. We returned to the room and found the body in a different position. His hand, which had earlier held mine, now hung beside the table. The eyes were still open, but just staring at the ceiling, without that terrible expression, just empty. After this, the rest of the work proceeded without problems. The day went by normally, as if none of this had happened. When I left, the service was ready. The family was to arrive early the next day. Before leaving, I approached one last time. I looked at him without fear, trying to see beyond the image that had frightened me earlier. Within the framework of my beliefs, I thanked him for allowing us to do our work, and then I went home. But what happened next is something that to this day, I don't know how to explain. I parked, entered, and found my husband in the room. He was sitting, watching me, but something about him was wrong. His face had an expression I had never seen before and never saw after that day. He seemed frozen. He didn't move, didn't blink, barely turned his head to follow me as I entered. And the scariest part, he was pale, very pale. I had never seen anyone so pale and still alive. My heart beat faster. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, but at first glance, everything seemed in order. He slowly stood up to greet me, but his movements were heavy, slow, as if he was in shock. Something had happened, and I knew I was about to find out what. I, of course, asked if he was okay and what had happened, but his answer left me incredulous. It made no sense at all. He said that about 30 minutes before my arrival, he had been sitting on the couch, watching television, waiting for me. We had exchanged messages, arranging what he wanted me to buy. After he gave me the list, I went to the store and sent another message, informing him that I was already returning, but he didn't respond. I thought he was in the kitchen, busy with dinner. And indeed, that was the plan. He would have started preparing the food. But then someone knocked on the door. He knew it wasn't me, since we both have keys to the apartment, which is on the 3rd floor. Before opening, he looked through the peephole and almost lost his breath. There, outside, standing in front of the door, was exactly the same man I had seen on the table that day. The same one, with the same appearance he had had in the hospital. The shock was immediate. In fear, he thought someone from the building might have been injured and needed help. He moved away from the peephole, unlocked the door, and there was no one there. Fear made him return to the couch, stunned, trying to understand what he had just seen. Soon after this, I arrived. So as not to frighten me, he initially said nothing, thinking it had been a mistake, that perhaps he was tired and had imagined the scene. But inside, he knew it wasn't a product of his imagination. The description he gave of this man's face was too accurate. And the scariest part, my husband didn't even know whom I had been preparing that day. It wasn't a coincidence. I remained uneasy. What did this man want? How had he managed to reach our home? I've heard stories about spirits that remain here for some time, stuck between two worlds. But after that day, he never appeared again. Not to me, not to anyone in the family. Months later, I told the entire story to my husband. He was visibly shaken, but tried to rationalize. He said that perhaps this man just wanted to thank me. But how could he have known where I live? And why did he appear precisely when I wasn't there? These questions remain unanswered. This was undoubtedly the most inexplicable experience of my life. To this day, I don't fully understand what happened. Will we ever understand what exists on the other side? How everything works? Is it possible to return, wander here for a time, receive permission to say goodbye? since I'm sitting here waiting for my ride, I might as well use this time to share something that happened to me a few years ago. I've never told anyone about this because it's still difficult to accept that it actually happened. But I can guarantee that everything I'm about to tell you was completely real. My morning routine always included waking up at 5:15 to exercise and leaving just after 6:30 to catch public transportation to work. I live in a cluster of brownstones in a quiet neighborhood not far from a well-known reservoir in the city. One day, as usual, I woke up at 5, but something was different. You know those rare mornings when you wake up completely refreshed, without a trace of fatigue? It was like that. I went through my routine normally, with one small addition. I put my phone in my jacket pocket before heading out. Before locking the door, I did my habitual check: wallet, cash, cards, keys, and phone. But at the last moment, I doubted whether I had actually grabbed my keys. I patted my pocket to confirm and noticed my phone wasn't there. I glanced at my watch, 6:25, just 5 minutes before I needed to leave. I went back inside, and while looking in all the usual places, found my keys, but realized I'd left my phone on the entryway table. In my rush, I walked out without it. That's when things started to get strange. I live on the 4th floor in a slightly elevated area, so every morning I'm greeted by a cool breeze as soon as I step outside. But that morning, the air was completely still, unnaturally motionless. I found it odd, but continued on my way to the bus stop. While still within my neighborhood, something caught my attention. The dogs that usually roam the area were nowhere to be seen. They're typically unpredictable. Sometimes they ignore you, other times they bark for no reason. But that morning, nothing. Not a single sign of them. I continued down the street, and a few blocks later, I noticed a woman dressed very elegantly. Unusually so for an ordinary weekday. She walked calmly and turned the corner, heading toward the bus terminal. I followed, maintaining a good distance, a habit of mine to avoid startling anyone at that hour. If someone is walking slowly and there isn't much space, I prefer to wait a bit before passing them. After a block, she seemed to notice my presence and stopped abruptly. I thought she was letting me pass. When I came within about 10 feet of her, I made a subtle detour to ensure I wouldn't get too close. At that moment, she turned her head to look directly at me. "Good morning," I said with a slight nod, avoiding direct eye contact. She didn't respond. She just stared at me, motionless, as if trying to comprehend something. Her face contorted into a strange expression, a mixture of astonishment and discomfort. I tried to ignore it, thinking perhaps it was because of my height. I'm 6'2", while she barely reached 5'4". It was early morning, and darkness can amplify feelings of vulnerability. But no matter how careful I was being, I sensed that I was caught in something much bigger than a casual interaction. I moved away, but I still felt the weight of her gaze on me. I peeked from the corner of my eye, and there she was, still motionless, staring at me as if trying to decipher something. I chose to ignore it and continue on my way. Soon I was near the street leading to the terminal. In the distance, I could see the long line for the first bus, while the second line was practically empty. Since I had left earlier than usual, I didn't find this strange. As I approached, something unsettling happened. The people in line suddenly shifted their gaze toward me, all at once. I positioned myself at the front of the empty line, waiting for the second bus. But I couldn't ignore the way they were watching me. Their stares were intense, similar to the woman I had left behind. Some people whispered among themselves, as if sharing a secret I wasn't part of. Suddenly, an elderly woman turned to me and said bluntly, "Young man, you shouldn't be here." The surprise made me hesitate. "What?" She leaned slightly toward me and repeated, "You can't board these shuttles." The word made me think of my grandmother. She used to call the smaller buses shuttles, those that weren't quite vans, but smaller than conventional buses. Before I could process this, one of these smaller buses pulled up, and people began boarding quickly. On the front display, I saw the number 7, but "You mustn't get on that one," insisted the elderly woman. I stood frozen, watching the crowd squeeze into the shuttle until it departed. I was still trying to understand the situation when a man who appeared to be in his 40s approached me. His gaze was serious and his voice firm. "Sir, this bus is only for people like you aren't. Not only can you not board, but you shouldn't even be here." There was something strange in the way he said "you." The intonation carried a weight that disturbed me. "I'm sorry, but I always take the bus downtown," I explained, confused. The man took a deep breath, clearly impatient. "That's exactly why I'm telling you that you shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." He stepped forward, and his authoritative tone seemed like an order. My instinct made me back away, and at that moment, I realized that everyone remaining in line was facing me, as if waiting for my next move. A chill ran down my spine. Something was very wrong there. I did what anyone would do. I ran back the way I had come. The journey home never seemed so long. I mentally calculated that at least 30 minutes must have passed since I left. I reached into my pocket wanting to check the time, but remembered I had left my phone at home. That's when I saw her again, on the same street I had passed through before. The woman was still there, standing, looking at me in the same way. I entered my house as quickly as I could, closed the door, and tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest. I went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water, sat down, and waited for my mind to calm down. When I felt a bit more lucid, I got up to check the time, already resigned to the fact that I would be late for work after all that. But the clock showed 6:35 in the morning. 25 minutes. Only 25 minutes had passed. How was that possible? Confused, I went out again. This time, the cool morning breeze enveloped me as always. The dogs barked when they saw me. The woman was no longer there. The buses followed their normal routes. The two usual lines had returned to their place. Everything was exactly as it should be. The strangest part, the bus I eventually boarded had the number 7 on it, the same as the shuttle I'd been warned not to enter. But this was a regular, full-sized bus, and no one gave me a second glance as I climbed aboard. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every detail in my mind. The stillness, the missing dogs, the woman's stare, the warnings from the strangers, and how, somehow, I had experienced nearly 30 minutes of an alternate reality, a glimpse into something beyond our normal perception. Since then, I've asked myself if, for a brief moment, I crossed into another world. Many believe that the dead can visit the world of the living. Perhaps in the same way, we can cross over to their side without realizing it. The difference is that ghosts know where they are. We, the living, do everything to deny the possibility of an encounter with death. But what if one day, death doesn't give us a choice? What if the boundary between worlds is thinner than we think, and sometimes, just sometimes, we slip through without realizing it until we're already there? I still take the same route to work. I still catch the number 7 bus. But now I always check the other passengers carefully. And I never, ever leave home without my phone. It wasn't long ago that this happened, right when I finally met my college roommates in person. We had started our freshman year entirely online during the pandemic lockdowns, and despite the distance, 3 of us formed an unusually strong bond, almost as if we'd been childhood friends. Our conversations flowed naturally through social media, and eventually extended into a popular online game we all played. One of us in particular had the habit of staying online until dawn, seemingly unconcerned about normal sleeping hours. At first, this didn't catch our attention. After all, irregular sleep schedules are practically a college student tradition. But when we finally moved into our off-campus apartment together during sophomore year, meeting face-to-face for the first time, the connection was immediate, like we'd known each other for years. And indeed, we've remained close friends since then. But what I'm about to tell you happened during that very first week of living together. I'll call them Tyler and Max. As for my own name and other identifying details, I'd prefer to keep those private. Max, as I'll refer to him from now on, made it clear I could share this story as long as there was nothing that could identify him. You'll soon understand why. We got along so well that our other classmates assumed we must have known each other from before, perhaps from high school or even earlier. The chemistry between us was remarkable, almost as if we were distant relatives reuniting after years apart. We shared the same taste in anime, played the same games, and had an eerily similar sense of humor. We connected so instantly that we decided to spend the first weekend together exploring the small New England town where our college was located. The older houses and narrow streets gave the place a distinctly historical feel, with most buildings dating back to the early 19th century. Our apartment was in one of those renovated Victorian houses just off Main Street, but at the quieter end, where the town began to thin out into scattered properties and eventually dense woods. Max's room had large bay windows that overlooked the back of our property and the neighboring buildings. From there, you could see all the way to the edge of town, where the forest began to reclaim the land. I knew the area somewhat. I had spent summers as a kid at my grandparents' farm, about 20 miles outside of town. That Friday evening after classes, we ordered pizza and planned to play through a new horror game Max had downloaded. The 3 of us crowded into his room with the lights off for maximum atmosphere, sitting with our backs to the large windows while facing his TV. Time slipped away, and before we knew it, the digital clock on Max's desk showed it was already past midnight. Occasionally, I would turn around to look out the windows. I gradually noticed that the town seemed increasingly deserted, as if everyone had simultaneously decided to stay indoors. The streets were unnaturally empty, even for a small town on a Friday night. The lone streetlight at the corner cast a weak, solitary glow over the intersection. We were interrupted by the buzz of Tyler's phone. On the other end was his sister, in the middle of an anxiety attack. She was alone with their younger brother at their parents' house, just a few blocks away. Without hesitation, Tyler said he needed to go check on them until their parents returned from their dinner date. He grabbed his jacket and disappeared into the darkness of the neighborhood. Max and I returned to his room, but our enthusiasm for continuing the game had evaporated. We just sat talking while my gaze kept returning to the window. The silence outside seemed abnormal, only that single lamppost illuminating the distant corner. That's when we heard a strange sound. At first, we thought someone might be knocking at our front door, but a quick check revealed nobody there. We soon realized the noise was coming from the backyard, a cluttered space filled with old furniture and storage items from previous tenants. We approached the window, trying to identify exactly where the noise was coming from. I climbed onto an old dresser to see over the wooden fence that separated our yard from the property behind us. On the other side, in near total darkness, I could make out the back of a stone building that faced the main road, but at a much lower elevation. There was about a 12-foot drop from our property to theirs. In that absolute blackness, two figures were struggling to force open a rear entrance door. I called Max over to look with me. We watched, undecided about what to do. We considered throwing something to scare them off, but what if they weren't thieves? What if they were just employees locked out? We had no idea what was happening. Suddenly Max shouted without thinking, "Hey, what are you doing there?" The two figures froze instantly. The noise stopped. That's when I could better distinguish their silhouettes. They were wearing something like white hooded robes or perhaps medical gowns. It was difficult to tell for certain. But what struck me most was the gleam of their eyes. They reflected a light that simply didn't exist from where we were standing. As soon as they noticed us, they began climbing the steep embankment that separated the stone building from our backyard. The slope was nearly vertical, a good 12 feet high. It shouldn't have been possible to climb it so quickly. Without a second thought, we ran. Fear took over as we bolted toward the front of the house, certain those figures were already approaching the wooden fence. We heard muffled sounds, as if someone was attempting to climb over or force their way through. The shock came from the front, a cry. It was Tyler, who had just returned. Even knowing we would be there, he was startled to see us rushing from the back of the house toward the street. We tried to explain, begging him not to go around back alone, that there were people trying to break in from the rear of the property. He ignored our warnings and went to check for himself. We had no choice but to follow him, but there was nothing there. The yard behind the house was empty, no sign of the figures we had seen minutes before. We explained they had been there just moments ago, that they must have fled when they heard us coming. But Tyler didn't seem particularly concerned about our story. Nobody broke in, and honestly, I'd rather not talk about the building back there. That place already gives me enough nightmares as it is. Without further explanation, he went to his room and left us standing there, confused. Max and I looked at each other, reluctant to return to his room with those windows facing directly onto the backyard and whatever lurked beyond. Instead, we decided to stay in the living room. Tyler emerged from his room about half an hour later. As soon as he entered, he sensed something was wrong. He stared at us for a moment before asking what had happened, but since he seemed determined not to discuss it, we opted to keep the story to ourselves. We only said we needed to get some fresh air. Max and I left together toward Main Street, where we could catch a late-night bus back to campus. The path seemed much longer than normal, every shadow leaving us uneasy. We deliberately crossed the street, walking on the opposite side, as far as possible from our apartment and whatever was behind it. That's when I felt Max grab my shoulder with force. I tried to understand what he wanted to say, but no words came out of his mouth. I followed his gaze, and in that instant, everything made sense. The stone building behind our apartment, the one where we had seen the two figures trying to open the door, had a clearly visible sign from across the street, a sign impossible to ignore. County Medical Examiner's Office. It was enough to send us running in a frantic sprint. We ran without stopping until we reached the more populated center of town, where we finally felt far enough away from that disturbing sight. We spent the rest of the night at the 24-hour diner near campus, not daring to return to our apartment until well after sunrise. On Monday, we finally told Tyler everything. He listened in silence, and when we finished, he sighed deeply. Then, with a tone of resignation, he revealed, "That's exactly why I hate living there. I can't stand sleeping in that room. Whenever possible, I stay up gaming until morning just to avoid looking outside or hearing anything." He told us that on numerous occasions, he had seen those same silhouettes wandering behind the medical examiner's building. He said they seemed to weep in a way that chilled him to the bone. But the worst part was when he, out of curiosity or compulsion, would peek through the window, because whenever he did, they would stop and turn to stare at him with those gleaming eyes. Tyler continued, lowering his voice. "My first week here, before you guys moved in, I researched the building. It was built in the 1870s as a municipal morgue, one of the first in the state. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, they were so overwhelmed that they reportedly performed autopsies around the clock, even setting up tents in the back lot to handle the overflow. I asked him if he'd ever seen the figures come any closer to our property. Just once, he said, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The night before you both arrived, I heard scratching at my window. When I looked, there was nothing there, but I swear I could see footprints in the mud leading from the fence to directly below my window. They were soaking wet, like someone had waded through water to get there. But it hadn't rained in weeks. We decided to change rooms that same day. Tyler moved to the front bedroom, and I took the smaller one facing the side street. Max chose to sleep on the couch in the living room, rather than stay in that back bedroom. A month later, we broke our lease and found a new apartment across town. To this day, none of us drives past that old Victorian house or the stone building behind it. Some nights, I still wake up feeling like something is watching me through my window, waiting for me to look back. And I never do. What if I told you that sometimes there are bodies in the morgue that no one wants to handle alone? Staff avoid being by themselves with them, prefer not to get close, and well, you might be wondering why. That's exactly what we're about to discover. I want to begin my account at the county medical examiner's office, where I still work. More specifically, in the morgue during the harsh winter of 2019. It was just past midnight when Dr. Mitchell approached me, wearing his typical charming smile, a clear sign he was about to ask for a favor. "My dear friend, so good to see you tonight. Ready for another night shift? You know, no one compares to you around here. Even the dead must smile when they see you coming," he said as soon as he spotted me walking in. "Evening, Mitchell. Cut it out. If anyone scares the deceased around here, it's you. They don't smile, they weep. I hope you've gone easy on them today. They're already dead. They don't need more suffering from your endless chatter," I replied with the same playful tone, smiling. He laughed but continued with the flattery while I clocked in. I knew his ways well. Compliments always came with a request behind them. To cut the conversation short, I decided to get straight to the point. "All right, Mitchell, what do you want this time?" He put his arm around my shoulders, and as we walked down the corridor, he lowered his voice to avoid curious ears. "Today's my daughter's 16th birthday. You know how it is. Her mother and I haven't been together for years, but we still have to come together for the kids. They called me begging to come to her house for dinner. Everyone's going to be there. I'd invite you too, but well, you've got your shift, right? So here's the thing. A body came in a little over an hour ago, and to be honest, I couldn't even start working on it. Just looking at it, I understood it was going to be one of those complicated cases." He glanced at me sideways, waiting for my reaction. "You know what I'm talking about, right? It's one of those special ones. The kind that requires time, patience, finesse. And since I know you love a challenge, I thought it would be unfair not to give you this opportunity. Don't get me wrong, colleague. I don't want to exploit your good nature, but today I really can't be late. You know my ex-wife and how my kids are. If I arrive late, I'll never hear the end of it." Mitchell took a deep breath and concluded with his request. "Can you take over this autopsy for me? But you have to start with this body, okay? It's already on the table waiting for you. Oh, and of course, this stays between us." When he talked about a special body, he was referring to those that nobody wanted to handle, cases that required more technique and patience. Still, I wasn't sure if that was the real reason, or if he just wanted to leave early. His ex-wife despised him, but because of the children, he was capable of anything, even enduring a birthday dinner that he probably preferred to avoid. All of us who worked there knew Dr. Mitchell well enough to know details about his personal life, especially his taste for spending money on certain ladies on weekends. So my suspicions were divided between two motives. Either he really didn't want to deal with that difficult case, or he was just trying to leave early. But in the end, it didn't matter. I didn't mind helping him as long as nobody noticed his departure, and he returned the favor later. So he left, and when I entered the morgue and saw the body on the table, I immediately understood why that sly fox hadn't even tried to touch it. One look was enough to realize it was an elderly, homeless woman. The state of the body was lamentable, filthy, with disheveled and tangled hair, a long and completely neglected beard. A few meters away, her clothes were piled up, as dirty and fetid as she was. But what impressed me most were the wounds, marks all over her skin resembling bites from small animals, as if they had been feeding on her. If any detail is too strong, I apologize, but it's important to understand the scene. The woman no longer had eyelids or eyes. Her half-open mouth revealed the absence of her lower lip, and part of her nose was also missing. There were no ears, and some fingers were missing as well. Additionally, the swelling indicated that decomposition was already advanced. Everything suggested they had taken a long time to find her. I went to the desk to check if Mitchell had at least started the report. There was only a single note. Apparent cause of death: rats fed on her while still alive, probably while unconscious due to alcoholic state. In other words, according to Mitchell, the woman was drunk when she was attacked. After reading that, I needed to take a deep breath. I walked to the bathroom in the room, turned on the faucet, and splashed some water on my face. But it wasn't preparation for work. It was a reflex of the numbness I felt imagining that terrible scene. A few drops ran down my chin before I composed myself. I had years of experience in the morgue, but faced with that body, the discomfort was inevitable. I prepared myself and began the autopsy. I had barely made the first cut in the chest when suddenly I heard the sound of the faucet turning on. The sound of running water echoed through the room. I froze for a moment. Had I left the faucet partially open? I put down the scalpel on the instrument table and went to check. That's when I got a shock. Inside the sink, fighting against the flow of water, was a small rat desperately trying to escape. My first instinct was to look for something to rescue it. I turned quickly, spotted a broom leaning in the corner of the room, and ran back to help the animal. But when I looked at the sink again, nothing. The rat had simply disappeared. I scanned the bathroom, checked every corner, nothing, no sign of it. I turned off the faucet and returned to the main room completely intrigued. There I was, surrounded by cadavers, with an elderly woman lying in front of me, and my mind stuck on the search for an animal that was there seconds ago, and now was simply gone. And all this right there in the morgue. I was still holding the broom when I heard the sound of the faucet turning on again. This time, the water was flowing slowly, as if someone had turned the knob gently. I advanced cautiously, each step laden with hesitation. What I expected to find, I didn't know. But one thing was certain: there was no sign of a rat. What I did find, however, made me freeze. The sink was full, the water standing still, not draining. But the worst wasn't that, it was red. I immediately dropped the broom and tried to back away, but my legs failed me, and I collapsed to the floor. It was at that moment that I saw something even more disturbing: the faucet turning by itself, shutting off the flow of water, while the red liquid slowly disappeared down the drain as if it had never been there. I got up as best I could and hurried out of the room, panting. In the corridor, I put my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and slow down my heart, which seemed about to leap out of my chest. I stayed there for several minutes, waiting for the sensation to pass. Fortunately, no one appeared to see me in that state. I wouldn't have known how to explain it, not to others, not even to myself. When I felt I could breathe again, I tried to rationalize. There had to be a logical explanation for it. Maybe the light, maybe my mind playing tricks. I decided to go back, convinced that I needed to see the sink again to prove to myself that it had been a momentary delusion. And indeed, upon entering, everything seemed normal. No trace of standing water, nothing red, no rat. Just a homeless woman's body on the autopsy table waiting for me. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and decided to cling to something greater. I made the sign of the cross and murmured softly, asking for clarity for my mind and peace for the deceased. After that, I continued with the work. For a good while, nothing strange happened. But then it did. In the middle of the autopsy, while handling the internal organs of the cadaver, I felt something unusual, a different texture. I continued moving, investigating. My stomach turned when I realized what it was: rat remains, parts scattered throughout the digestive tract, lodged in the throat. The more I searched, the more I found. And then out of the corner of my eye, something moved. My vision instinctively directed toward the mouth of the cadaver, or what remained of it. There was movement there, small, subtle, but real. I fixed my gaze. No, it couldn't be, but it was. Inside the half-open mouth of the deceased, a live rat. My heart raced. My years of experience hadn't prepared me for that. In the morgue, we had strict pest control. I had never seen a single rodent there. So why now, with this body, were rats appearing? Was it a coincidence? If it was too much of one. Still trying to maintain control, I tried to remove the animal from the cadaver. But as soon as I approached, the rat burrowed into the woman's throat, disappearing inside her. I dropped everything and ran across the hospital, straight to a colleague's office, the only one who might listen to me without thinking I was insane. As soon as he saw me, he realized my state. More than the story I told, it was my expression that frightened him. He didn't know what to say. He just looked at me. After a few minutes, I begged him to accompany me to the morgue. I needed someone else to see it. I needed confirmation and explanation. He agreed, but when we got there, everything was normal. The cadaver remained as I had left it, chest open, without any changes. No sign of rodents, no new bites, nothing to prove what I had seen. My colleague gave me a concerned look and asked if I wanted him to stay with me. I replied that I didn't need company. My colleague insisted that I suspend the work and go home to rest. He said it was evident that I wasn't well. I thanked him for the advice, but warned that I would at least finish with that body. I needed to conclude it that very night. He said goodbye and left, leaving me alone again. The worst had already passed. Nothing else happened while I finalized the autopsy. All that was left was to write the report. The environment was silent, and for the first time that night, I felt calmer. I decided to rest a little before concluding everything. I sat in the chair next to the desk, facing the cadaver that had made me go through the worst night of my career so far. My mind was slowly thinking about the report, the shift, and what I had witnessed. Had all of that been real, or just the product of extreme fatigue? I tilted my head back and took a deep breath. It was at that moment that I heard a noise, a low hiss but distinct. It came from the floor. I looked down, and as I did, my body froze. There, circling between my feet with the utmost naturalness, was a rat. But not just any rat, it was her, that same creature I had seen in the sink. She walked unhurriedly, without fear, as if this were her territory, not mine. At a certain point, she stopped, raised her head, and stood on her hind legs, staring directly at me. The small snout moved rapidly, as if smelling me from a distance. My immediate instinct was to move my foot away and prepare to kick her forcefully. But before I could do that, a metallic sound echoed through the room. The autopsy table was creaking. My gaze shot up in reflex, diverting from the rat for a second, and that's when I saw it. The cadaver was sitting, facing me. The head was slowly tilting to the side, as if observing me. But that was impossible. She had no eyes, only two empty, swollen, and dark orbits like bottomless holes. I wanted to move, run, scream, but nothing responded. My body refused to react. And then the last image I recorded from that scene, the woman's jaw detaching, simply coming unglued from her face, falling to the floor while she continued to stare at me with her absent eyes. I don't exactly remember what happened next. Everything became blurry. The only certainty I have is that my colleague found me there, fallen, motionless. As soon as he entered, he let out an expletive, grabbed by surprise, ran to me, pushed the cadaver back onto the metal table, and got me out of there. I spent months in therapy after that day. The doctor who rescued me claimed to have seen the body sit up, which was already absurd enough considering it had been dead for a good while. But beyond that, nothing else. No rat, no new injury, no detail of what I had seen existed for anyone else. The truth is we never knew who that woman really was. The most I could discover was that they found her lifeless under a bridge, being devoured by rats. The place was in a region marked by rumors. They said it was frequented by people involved with occultism and shadowy rituals. I never considered going there to find out if this was true. I preferred to continue with this doubt. After a few weeks away, I returned to work, but it would take an entire year until I could do a night shift completely alone again. During all that time, someone was always with me as a precaution, at the insistence of colleagues, or perhaps just to make sure I wouldn't go crazy alone. I'm still here today. They say that when a body is delivered to forces that we don't understand and prefer not to name, neither matter nor spirit finds rest, that the soul continues to wander, not only in the depths of the unknown, but also among us. Perhaps this account is proof of that. My encounter was brief, but it marked my life in ways that haunt me to this day. During a period in my life when I was desperate for work, I took a position as an assistant to the county coroner in a small town hospital. I was completely inexperienced, but I also prided myself on being a rational person. I didn't believe in supernatural phenomena or anything of the sort. I worked the night shift from midnight until dawn. On my first day, a colleague who had previously held the same position made a point of warning me. Strange things happen in the dead hours before sunrise, but don't worry. Just continue with your duties and ignore it all. Being naturally skeptical, I didn't pay much attention to his comment. On one of those nights, when the autumn wind howled outside the old building, the coroner asked me to go to the cold storage room to verify the number of bodies stored there. I walked down the long, poorly lit corridor that led to the location. Several light bulbs had burned out, leaving the environment in that uncomfortable twilight state. It was a rural facility from the 1970s, so you can imagine how outdated everything was. As soon as I entered, I began counting. Everything seemed normal until, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a subtle movement. One of the bodies, covered by a sheet, seemed to have changed position, as if the head had turned slightly toward me. My heart raced and I froze in place. With nerves on edge, I approached slowly and pulled back the sheet. What I saw confirmed my worst fear. The head of the corpse was turned exactly to where I was standing. A shiver ran down my spine, and a strange coldness took over my body. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself it was just a mistake, that perhaps the body had shifted during transport. Then I covered the body again and forced myself to continue the task. The silence was absolute, but seconds later it was broken by a sound I will never forget. A low, drawn-out lament coming from the back of the room. A male voice, laden with pain and desperation. My blood turned to ice. I didn't need to look back to understand what was happening. Without thinking twice, I ran from there as fast as my legs would allow. I only stopped when I reached the coroner's office. I was shaking completely, breathless, pale, unable to utter a single word. For a moment I thought about reporting what had happened, but I hesitated. The coroner looked at me for several seconds without saying anything, but his gaze said it all. He had seen that expression before. He knew. At that moment, all I wanted was for the sun to rise so I could leave. But even as dawn broke through the windows, casting long shadows across the morgue floor, I knew I wouldn't find peace. Because what I hadn't told you yet was that I recognized the voice. It belonged to my uncle, who had passed away 3 years earlier. The same uncle whose funeral I had refused to attend. In the months that followed, other things happened. Objects would move on their own in that room. Sometimes, when I was alone doing paperwork, I would hear footsteps approaching from the hallway, only to find nobody there. Once I found all the drawer tags in the cold storage rearranged to spell out, "Remember ME," when read in sequence. I stayed at that job for exactly 1 year before I couldn't take it anymore. On my last night, as I was preparing to leave forever, I heard a whisper directly in my ear. "We all have to serve our time here. Yours is just beginning." I never returned to that hospital, but sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I still hear that lament. And I wonder if, someday, I'll be the one making that sound. My name is Daniel, and I've been working as a medical examiner for 15 years in a small coastal town in Maine. I've always been comfortable with the solitude of morgues, the night shifts, the darkness, the stillness. Death has been my constant companion, and I've grown accustomed to its presence. But what happened during that winter of 1997 changed everything. I thought I knew about the barrier between life and death. I had recently transferred to Old Harbor Memorial Hospital, taking over the graveyard shift alongside Mark, a fellow pathologist who had been there for about 3 years. The facility was housed in a converted 19th century sanatorium, all brick and narrow windows, with a labyrinthine basement where the morgue was located. The antiquated architecture seemed to trap echoes and shadows, but I initially dismissed my unease as simple adjustment to a new workplace. For the first 2 months, everything proceeded routinely. We'd receive bodies, perform examinations, complete paperwork, and store them in the cold chambers until funeral homes came to collect them. The rhythmic predictability of death was almost comforting. Then came that night in late January. The temperature outside had dropped to 15 below zero, and the old building's heating system struggled against the bitter cold. Just after 2 in the morning, local police brought us the body of an elderly woman discovered in her isolated Victorian house on the outskirts of town. According to the officers, she had no known relatives, and neighbors only realized something was wrong when a postal worker noticed mail piling up and detected a sickening odor emanating from inside the home. Her name was Agatha Blackwood, according to her weathered driver's license from 1972. The decay suggested she had been dead for at least 2 weeks, despite the cold temperatures in her unheated house apparently slowing decomposition. Her skin had taken on that characteristic leathery appearance, and the distinctive smell of advanced decay clung to her remains. We performed the standard procedures, documenting external conditions, collecting samples, conducting the autopsy, and finally placing her body in one of the cold storage chambers at the far end of the hallway. After securing the heavy metal door with its locking mechanism, Mark and I retreated to the small break room adjacent to the main examination area. It was nearly 4 in the morning, and we were both exhausted. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee from the ancient percolator, while Mark unwrapped a sandwich he'd brought from home. "Something feels different about this one," he said absently, staring into his styrofoam cup. "How so?" I asked, though I'd felt it too, a subtle shift in the atmosphere since her body arrived. "Can't put my finger on it," Mark replied. "Just a feeling, like we're not alone anymore." I was about to dismiss his comment when we both froze at the sound that penetrated the quiet, a distinct metallic creak, the unmistakable noise of one of the cold chamber doors swinging open. We exchanged a glance, neither wanting to acknowledge what we'd heard. "You locked it, right?" Mark whispered, his sandwich forgotten on the table. "Of course I did," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I always double-check the mechanism." We both knew that those doors couldn't open on their own. They were heavy stainless steel with industrial-grade latches. Even if I had somehow forgotten to secure it properly, the negative pressure inside the chambers would keep them sealed. Reluctantly, we made our way down the dim corridor toward the storage area. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows that seemed to pulse with each step. When we reached the chamber room, my blood ran cold. The door to compartment 13, where we had placed Ms. Blackwood, stood ajar by several inches. "That's impossible," I muttered, approaching cautiously. Mark hung back, his face pale in the harsh lighting. "I don't like this, Daniel." I pushed the door closed and verified the latch engaged properly. "Probably just the old building settling," I offered, though we both knew that explanation was inadequate. These mechanisms are original to the 40s. They're bound to malfunction occasionally. We returned to the break room, but the casual conversation that usually filled our downtime had evaporated. An oppressive weight seemed to fill the space between us, making the air itself feel dense and difficult to breathe. Neither of us wanted to address the unspoken dread that had settled over the morgue. After about 30 minutes, Mark excused himself to use the restroom down the hall. I stayed behind, trying to focus on updating our examination reports. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant drip of a leaky pipe were the only sounds, until Mark's terrified shout echoed through the corridor. I bolted from my chair and ran toward the bathroom. When I pushed open the door, I found Mark standing frozen before the row of sinks, his eyes locked on the large mirror that spanned the wall. "What happened?" I asked, scanning the room for anything unusual. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "She was here, standing right behind me." He raised a trembling finger toward the mirror. "Agatha Blackwood. She was watching me. She spoke to me." "What did she say?" I asked, unable to stop myself. Mark's eyes finally shifted from the mirror to meet mine. "She said we shouldn't have disturbed her rest. That she wasn't finished yet." His voice cracked. "Daniel, she looked exactly like she did on our table, but her eyes were alive." I placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremors running through his body. "Listen, Mark, we've been working too many consecutive shifts. Sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, especially in environments like this." But Mark shook his head vehemently. "I know what I saw." Her skin was still gray and mottled, her hair matted with decay, but she moved. She smiled at me, Daniel. His voice dropped even lower. "No one smiles like that unless they mean harm." I convinced Mark to go home early, assuring him I could handle the remainder of our shift. Though I would never admit it aloud, I was relieved when he agreed. His fear was becoming contagious, and I needed time alone to rationalize what was happening. After he left, I immersed myself in paperwork, determined to keep my mind occupied. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching longer than the last. Around 5:30, as the first hint of dawn should have been appearing, though invisible from our windowless basement, the lights began to flicker. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible. Then the intervals between flickers grew shorter, until suddenly, the entire morgue was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight feature, and made my way toward the circuit breaker panel near the storage area. The beam of light created more shadows than illumination, transforming the familiar corridors into an alien landscape. As I rounded the corner toward the utility room, my light fell upon something that stopped me in my tracks. Seated on one of the empty examination tables was Agatha Blackwood. Her body remained in the same state of decomposition as when we'd examined her: the sunken cheeks, the discolored skin, the hollow eyes. But she was upright, her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she regarded me. I stood paralyzed, my medical training and rational mind battling against what my eyes were witnessing. Then, without her lips moving, a sound emerged from her, a low, rattling laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It reverberated off the tiled walls, growing in volume until it filled my head completely. Primal instinct took over. I turned and ran blindly through the darkened corridor, my phone clattering to the floor as I fled. Just as I reached the main examination room, the lights surged back to life. I spun around, expecting to see her pursuing me, but the hallway was empty. With shaking hands, I called Dr. Lawrence, the morgue director. Despite the early hour, he answered on the third ring, and I poured out everything that had happened, trying to keep my voice from breaking. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss my account, but promised to come in immediately. I waited outside in the parking lot, the pre-dawn air burning my lungs as I gulped it down. When Dr. Lawrence arrived 30 minutes later, concern etched on his weathered face. He asked only one question. "Are you all right?" I nodded automatically, though we both knew it was a lie. Together, we re-entered the morgue and went directly to compartment 13. Agatha Blackwood's body lay exactly as we had left it, showing no signs of disturbance. Dr. Lawrence examined the chamber door's locking mechanism, finding it fully functional. He then reviewed our autopsy findings and suggested I go home while he covered the remainder of the shift. When I returned the following evening, Dr. Lawrence was waiting for me in his office. The expression on his face made my stomach tighten. "You weren't imagining things," he said without preamble. "Something is wrong here." He explained that after I'd left, he had heard it too, that same chilling laugh coming from the storage area. Disturbed by the experience, he had spent the day gathering information about Agatha Blackwood from the community. What he discovered sent ice through my veins. For over 40 years, she had lived alone in that Victorian house, shunned by neighbors who crossed to the opposite side of the street when passing her property. Local lore painted her as a practitioner of the occult. Parents warned their children to stay away from the witch house, and there were whispered stories of strange lights and sounds emanating from her basement at odd hours. But here's what troubles me most, Doctor. Lawrence continued. 3 decades ago, a 7-year-old boy disappeared in the neighborhood. The investigation eventually stalled without resolution, but several witnesses reported seeing the child near her property on the day he vanished. He paused, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. 2 of the original investigators died under unusual circumstances within a year of the case. One from sudden heart failure despite no prior health issues, the other in a single vehicle accident on a clear day on a straight road. Doctor. Lawrence leaned forward, lowering his voice though we were alone. The most disturbing part is what I found when I re-examined her personal effects. Hidden in the lining of her purse was this. He placed a yellowed newspaper clipping on the desk between us. The headline read, "Local boy still missing after 3-week search." Below it was a photo of a smiling child, no more than 7 years old. "Turn it over," he instructed. On the back, written in faded ink, were symbols I didn't recognize, surrounding the words, "Bound in flesh, bound in spirit." An older woman who had lived across from Agatha for decades told Dr. Lawrence something that resonated with both of us, that some souls are too corrupt to simply pass on, that they cling to this world through unnatural means. She had insisted that cremation was the only way to ensure whatever dark energy Agatha possessed wouldn't persist after death. Normally, I would have dismissed such superstition, but after what we had experienced, neither of us was willing to take chances. With no family to claim her remains and documentation showing she had no religious objections to cremation, Dr. Lawrence expedited the necessary paperwork. The following morning, Agatha Blackwood's remains were transported to the crematorium. I insisted on accompanying the body, watching as the container was slid into the retort, and the intense heat began its work. Only when the process was complete did I feel the tension that had gripped me for days finally begin to dissolve. When I returned to work that night, the difference was palpable. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated the morgue had lifted. The air felt lighter, the sounds of the old building once again familiar rather than menacing. Mark noticed it too when he arrived for his shift, commenting that it felt like a storm had passed. I continued working at Old Harbor Memorial for another 7 years. During that time, we handled hundreds of cases without incident. But I never forgot Agatha Blackwood, and the nights when the boundary between life and death seemed to blur. The experience taught me that some mysteries lie beyond scientific explanation, that there are darker truths lurking beneath the surface of what we think we understand. Sometimes in the quietest hours before dawn, I still recall the sound of that laugh, hollow and ancient and hungry. And I'm reminded that some presences linger, some hatreds persist, and some evils never truly die. They simply wait for the opportunity to manifest once again. My name is Alina, and I've been working as a medical examiner in the city of New Orleans for nearly 2 decades. Throughout these years, I've witnessed countless peculiar situations in morgues. It's undeniable that these places harbor unusual occurrences. Not surprising, considering that many who arrive here experienced sudden and violent deaths. I've always had the sensation that those who depart so abruptly find it difficult to move on. Though my training is deeply rooted in science, I cannot ignore certain episodes that make me believe something exists beyond our understanding. Among the many experiences I've accumulated over the years, one has always left a profound mark on me. It happened during the winter of 1997, during a particularly fierce storm that had paralyzed much of the city. That night I was working alone in the morgue, accompanied only by Maxwell, the security guard on duty. Around 2:30 in the morning, the body of a young woman in her early 20s arrived, a victim of a boating accident that had occurred just hours earlier during the storm. Her small pleasure craft had collided with a larger vessel in the darkness and fog of the Mississippi River. I recorded the necessary data, and as soon as the paramedics left, I began the autopsy. I won't go into details, but the injuries she presented were severe, trauma to the head and chest, consistent with the violent impact. Her youthful face, still bearing traces of what must have been a vibrant life, touched me deeply. After completing the procedure, I approached Maxwell to ask if any relative had come looking for her. He answered that no one had made contact yet. I took advantage of a pause to use the restroom, and from a distance, I heard his voice conversing with someone. I quickened my pace, imagining that a family member of the girl might have arrived. I dried my hands and headed to the reception area. To my surprise, Maxwell was alone. "Who was just here?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was a young woman," he said. "She mentioned she was lost and needed help getting back to her apartment in the Garden District. She seemed disoriented but polite. Since I couldn't leave my post, I explained where she could find a taxi stand despite the storm. She thanked me and left. I found it strange, but didn't dwell on the matter and returned to work. The rest of the night proceeded normally, until suddenly, without explanation, the body of the young accident victim fell from the examination table. The sound of impact on the floor made my blood run cold. There was no one there besides me, and the position in which she had been placed made a spontaneous fall impossible. Unable to lift the body alone, I went to Maxwell for help. He agreed and accompanied me back to the examination room. But as soon as he saw the young woman's face, all color drained from his. He stood motionless, staring fixedly at her. "What's wrong?" I asked, feeling the tension in the air. His voice came out trembling. "It's her. It was her who came asking for help earlier. I'm absolutely certain. She has the same distinctive pearl earrings and that unique silver bracelet on her left wrist." My body froze. The air grew heavy, and all I could say was, "Are you certain?" He nodded quickly, still pale. Together, we placed the body back on the table and left the room. The silence between us spoke louder than any words. The only thing we could eventually whisper was that perhaps that poor soul hadn't yet understood what had happened to her. Perhaps she just wanted to return home. But more than fear, that night I felt an immense sadness. She was a young woman whose life had been abruptly taken away. And from all indications, she hadn't even realized she was no longer among the living. 3 days later, when her family finally identified her, I learned her name was Elise, and she had just moved to the Garden District for her first job after college. She had been on that boat, celebrating her new beginning. A celebration that became an ending she couldn't yet comprehend. Sometimes on stormy nights, when I'm working late, I think I hear someone asking for directions home. I never see anyone, but I always pause and silently hope Elise has finally found her way. Good evening. My name is Vincent, and I've decided to share everything that happened to me in hopes of preventing someone else from walking the same dangerous path. I won't mention the name of the small coastal town where I grew up because I don't think it matters. What's important is that everything was real to me. And as strange as it might seem, I still believe something like this could happen to anyone caught in a moment of desperation. I was born into a middle-class family in the late 80s. My father worked as a sales manager at a hardware store, putting in long hours to provide us with a decent life. My mother, Amelia, spent her youth helping my grandmother at home without many opportunities for education. After she married, she devoted herself entirely to me and my older sister, Claire. Mom would always say, "I have absolutely no problem being just a mom, because nothing is more rewarding to me than taking care of my children." As a kid, I didn't fully understand what that meant. To me, she was simply always there, attentive to everything and ready to defend me. I was the spoiled youngest child. My father took immense pride in having a son, especially since he had grown up in a household full of women and felt pressured to continue the family name. I think that's why he ended up giving me more attention than my sister. I received many gifts, watched movies on VHS whenever I wanted, had the best school supplies. And while I was surrounded by comfort, Claire, 8 years older than me, had to save her pocket change just to buy nail polish or the occasional candy. I confess that back then, I didn't even notice this imbalance. Only years later did I realize how much it had hurt her. My early years were pure fun. My mother used to say I was an incredibly heavy sleeper. Sometimes I'd sleep for 12 or 13 hours straight and wake up full of energy. During this period, I had recurring dreams about a man who invited me to visit beautiful places, farms filled with plants and animals. In the dreams, he had a friendly demeanor, And even though the context seemed strange, after all, he appeared mounted on a white horse wearing unusual clothes. I enjoyed accompanying him on these dream journeys. The problem arose when my mother started to worry, because once I slept for almost an entire day. She took me to the hospital to make sure I wasn't in a coma. After that, at her request, I began to refuse the invitations that appeared in my dreams. The man still appeared once or twice, but I stopped following him. When I turned 10, my parents separated. My father had cheated on my mother. She discovered everything, and despite his pleas for forgiveness, she couldn't move past it. I remember him leaving the house, carrying some clothes in an old suitcase. He stayed at his brother's place. I cried a lot because my father was my hero, my protector. It's true that he had constant arguments with Claire, sometimes even forbidding her from going out or having friends over. But with me, he was the most affectionate person imaginable. He never let me want for anything, and I preferred to ignore how he treated my sister. After he left, everything changed. My mother started working outside the home to pay the bills, and I was alone most of the time because Claire also went out a lot. She felt she had regained the freedom stolen from her childhood, so she barely appeared at home except to sleep. We became a dysfunctional family. I felt an immense loneliness, and by 12, I started looking for other ways to fill the void. First, I got close to classmates who were secretly smoking and drinking. Then I moved on to drugs. I didn't think it was that serious to me. It was just fun. At 13, my mother met a guy and started dating him. He wasn't a bad person, but he was considerably younger than her. I didn't want anyone taking my father's place, so I started having disagreements with both of them. The truth is that throughout middle school, my life was a mess. I felt abandoned. My sister, on the other hand, noticed my involvement with substances and tried to talk to me. But she ended up giving up because I insulted her or created an unbearable atmosphere. It wasn't until I turned 15 that I had my first detox, thanks to an involuntary commitment that my mother and Claire organized. I stayed in a clinic for almost 2 months. When I got out, I felt more energetic, but not really that different, honestly, and soon returned to using the same substances. At 16, I took a quick computer course to find a job. My mother had advised me to find some direction, because life wasn't just about partying and frivolity. During this period, my sister began to get more involved with spirituality. I was certain she possessed some kind of perception beyond the normal. She even warned me about visions she had concerning me. In fact, she helped me in various situations, preparing herbal baths, forcing me to stay away from terrible company. I think if it weren't for her, I might not even be here to tell this story. Even so, my contact with drugs continued, albeit with less intensity. When I turned 18, I got an internship at a small company. The work was physical, but I felt good about starting to earn my own money. Around this same time, my father reappeared in my life, saying he missed me, and that, having converted to a church, he had decided to ask forgiveness for the mistakes he had made. I learned that he had been absent during this period, living from odd jobs at relatives' homes, until he found stability after his conversion. This filled me with resentment. I hadn't seen him in years, and now he appeared talking about Bible passages. My mother said I should forgive him, But it wasn't that simple. He brought his wife, a woman who seemed quite rigid, and tried to convince me that I needed to accept the right path to avoid suffering more. I rolled my eyes several times while they spoke. Nevertheless, I couldn't completely hate him because I still had good memories from when we lived together. At 19, I met a girl named Lydia who was 2 years younger than me. At first, we became friends. She had a light conversation style, made me laugh even though I wasn't the most balanced person in the world. Lydia brought some hope into my life. After about 6 months, we started dating. 8 months into our relationship, she got pregnant. It was a shock, but I loved her. We moved in together with hardly any planning. My mother helped with some furniture, and Claire donated some baby clothes she had kept from her friends. As time passed, I realized I wasn't prepared for the responsibility of having a family. I worked during the day, studied at night, and stayed up until dawn at occasional parties, sometimes completely out of my mind. Lydia tried to make me stay home more. To some extent, I tried, but in a short time, I would return to partying. Our son was born when I was 20. I was emotional when I saw him for the first time, but I maintained my bad habits. Lydia threatened to leave. I didn't take it seriously, but after a few months, she really packed her bags and moved with the baby to her mother's house. It was a hard blow, but I was so numb from everything that I didn't do anything to stop her. Still, I felt an immense void. The child was only a few months old, and I already felt like a failure. I began to think that perhaps my destiny was to follow the same path as my father. At 21, the situation worsened. My mother discovered a serious illness that quickly proved difficult to treat. While she fought for her life, I sank deeper into addiction. I lost my internship because I stopped showing up, and money became scarce. I began living in a tiny room in an old building, supported basically by what Claire could give me. I never stopped loving my mother, but I couldn't bear to see her suffering. It was one of the darkest periods of my life. In the midst of all this, I started having that sensation again of a presence surrounding me, like when I was a child, except this time, instead of inviting me to peaceful places, it seemed to provoke me. Occasionally, I would hear something like someone whispering my name during the night. I confess I had doubts whether it was hallucination, or if there really was something with me. I didn't rule out any possibility given the situation I was living in. In the middle of this chaos, I remembered the powerful prayers and rituals my sister performed. I thought that perhaps there was something more powerful in spirituality, capable of solving issues that medicine wasn't conquering. That's how I dove headfirst into websites about occultism and witchcraft. I researched for hours, reading about entities that could supposedly cure diseases in exchange for offerings or promises. The fear of losing my mother left me beside myself. I was willing to risk everything. So one night, after hours of reading about pacts, I decided to try one. It was something simple, or so it seemed. I had to make some oaths of devotion in front of a lit candle, and in exchange, ask for the salvation of whoever I wanted. In the end, I wrote my name on a piece of paper along with my mother's, and burned it, reciting some words I found on an occult forum. I woke up the next day not knowing if that would make any sense. My mother was in the hospital, and I was certain she wouldn't make it through that week. I heard some relatives saying the doctors had nothing more to do. I went to visit her in the afternoon. I thought I would find her very weakened, but she was a bit more alert. She still had various machines in the room, but when I looked at her, I noticed she was speaking more clearly. I didn't consider it an immediate miracle. I thought it was just some temporary reaction to medication. However, 3 days later, I was surprised by a significant improvement. She was discharged, even though she was still weak. The doctors didn't quite understand what was happening. This was a serious disease that usually progressed rapidly. My mother continued treatment at home with frequent visits for tests, but she survived. After that, I was suspicious. Did the ritual actually work, or was it just a coincidence? I couldn't find an answer. In any case, my mother was alive and relatively well, which calmed me down. I went back to work, now at a small market, but I continued drinking and getting into fights. At home, alone, I found myself talking to that supposed presence. I didn't see anything concretely, but from time to time, I had the impression of catching a clear voice in the silence. This bothered me, but I tried to ignore it. A year later, when I was 22, Lydia reappeared. She wanted me to get closer to our son, who was then over 2 years old. I thought that was both good and bad. Good because I missed the child, bad because I didn't feel capable of being a present father. Anyway, we started trying to resume a healthy coexistence. Lydia did me an enormous amount of good. But around the same time, my life began to deteriorate financially. The owner of the market wanted to put his own nephew in my place, so I was fired. I was desperate. Bills were arriving. My son's child support was low but still an obligation, and I couldn't find another job. Then, in my naivety, I remembered how my mother had improved and thought I could make a new pact, this time asking for financial success. I researched even more on the internet, reading an enormous number of accounts from people who claimed to have prospered after making agreements with entities. I confess that deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed or if I was just desperate, but I proceeded. I prepared a complex ritual with some offerings that included fruits, incense, and several candles. I did everything in an abandoned building, far from downtown, on a rainy late afternoon. If this sounds like a movie scene, I guarantee it was nothing glamorous. The rain dripped through the cracks in the roof, and I tried to protect the candles with pieces of plastic. I read some verses I got from a PDF book about occultism, and when I finished, I felt a strange weight, as if I were promising loyalty to something without understanding the consequences. I won't say I saw dense smoke or shadows, but I had the sensation of having invaded the privacy of someone who didn't want me there. I closed everything up and left. In the days that followed, I expected an immediate financial response. Nothing happened. I continued unemployed, knocking on the doors of stores. About 15 days later, I received a call from a former boss who had opened a small food distribution company. He offered me a job that paid twice what I earned before. I was euphoric and accepted immediately. After a few months, I started saving, and even with child support, I still managed to set aside a considerable amount. I thought it worked again. However, I remembered that I had recited many different prayers and promised my dedication, although without great clarity about what that meant in terms of future obligations. I felt that it could cost me dearly, and the charges came quickly. I began to have a type of recurring nightmare in which a voice demanded a greater commitment from me. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my body sweating, not knowing if it was just anxiety or if there really was something demanding from me. In these moments, I remembered the ritual I had done to get money, as I knew I had somehow sworn fidelity. Every 2 or 3 nights, I dreamed of someone staring at me. It wasn't a monster, but a male adult figure who looked at me as if he were waiting for me to fulfill some duty. He appeared to be in his early 30s, just like the old memory from my childhood, where I only saw a man mounted on a horse. Perhaps he always had the same appearance, but when I was a child, I wasn't able to discern details like the exact age. Even so, I was enjoying the good phase. I met a new woman, Hannah, who worked at the same distribution company. She was independent and wouldn't tolerate my outbursts of arrogance. She said she would only stay with me if I showed maturity. Hannah said, "If you don't change, there's no way I can continue with you." I accepted the challenge, and we ended up becoming a couple. I still occasionally met Lydia to see our son. She knew about my relationship, and despite some initial tension, everything went without major conflicts. Hannah and I moved in together after less than 6 months of dating. I was obsessed with the idea of having a nice house, so I started buying furniture and appliances on installment, certain that my financial ascension would be lasting. I worked day and night, did overtime, doubled shifts when necessary. I earned well, but spent almost everything. All that mattered to me was having status, showing that I was winning. That's when a serious problem emerged. A little more than a year after this sudden improvement, my mother's condition worsened abruptly. The doctors confirmed that the disease she had was in a new, even more aggressive phase. She was hospitalized in critical condition. My sister Claire started taking care of her full time, and I, agonized, decided to bet again on what had already given me results before. I resorted to the same rituals, but didn't get the immediate improvement that had happened the first time. Desperate, I intensified the prayers I found in forums. I wanted to offer more devotion to save my mother's life. That's when I had a frightening dream, although it wasn't full of special effects. Basically, the male figure, who now seemed to be the same man as always, appeared in an empty environment. He didn't have wings or demonic features, but he exerted an authority over me. Without moving his lips, he told me I needed to obey certain rules and offer small sacrifices, without explaining what they were, so that my mother wouldn't die. I woke up disturbed. 2 days later, I received news that my mother had a slight improvement, but needed a risky procedure. While she underwent this surgery, I stayed at home and did what I understood as a symbolic sacrifice. I donated a large part of the money I had saved to a charity institution that my sister knew. My logic was that the value was the fruit of the agreement I had made, and therefore returning it somehow could fulfill the requirement. The act left me more relieved. The following night, I slept almost peacefully without any nightmares. Fortunately, the surgery was successful, and my mother stabilized. The relief, however, was short-lived. After a few weeks, I began to have serious relationship problems with Hannah. She accused me of being absent, of spending hours buried in the computer looking for weird forums. The arguments became frequent. Once she left the house in tears, saying I was obsessed with strange things and that I didn't include her in absolutely anything. The situation became so complicated that we broke up. She left, taking few things with her. I continued in our apartment, full of accumulated installments and without the slightest motivation to pay. Once again, everything seemed to be falling apart. The distribution company where I worked was facing difficulties. After some personnel cuts, I was fired. With the money from bills accumulating, each day was a nightmare. My father reappeared again during this time, insisting that I go to his church, saying that God could free me from any evil. My father would say to me, "Son, you need to accept the Lord's path to get rid of all this suffering." I listened to him, but didn't feel ready to follow this path. My sister tried to support me, asking me to pray or take herbal baths, but I was distressed, full of doubts. Some nights I dreamed again of that man, whom I now called the visitor. He seemed to demand something from me in exchange for everything I had received, and I didn't even know how to name what he wanted. The last straw came when my son became very ill. He was just over 4 years old and had to be hospitalized with a severe respiratory infection. I relived the desperation of before. Lydia called me crying, asking for help. I had no means to finance anything. I spent days without sleeping, walking through the corridors of a public hospital. In an act of desperation, I decided to go to a local spiritual center that was a few blocks from the building where I lived. I arrived there without telling anyone, begging for help. I explained that I felt a presence in my life for years that seemed to help me sometimes, but also slowly destroyed me. I was attended by a middle-aged woman who invited me to participate in a cleansing ritual. She didn't make incredible promises, but said that perhaps it was necessary to break a type of spiritual bond. I was somewhat skeptical, but accepted anything that could save my son. Inside there were some prayers, guidance on how I should set aside certain practices and dedicate myself to good, so to speak. Although there wasn't an intense choreography or something very spectacular, I felt a great fatigue when it ended. The spiritual advisor, as they called her there, looked me in the eyes and spoke very calmly. The spiritual advisor whispered, "You messed with things you don't understand, didn't you?" I nodded my head. I neither denied nor confirmed, but she continued. The spiritual advisor added, "This bond doesn't break from 1 hour to the next. You're going to need perseverance and a lot of faith. The help that came before can turn into a demand now. Think carefully about the path you want to follow." I left stunned, spent that night restless, questioning if I had really tied my life to some entity. The next day, my son showed improvement. He still spent 7 more days in the hospital, but returned home. Lydia hugged me, emotional. I felt an enormous relief, but this time, I knew I couldn't continue repeating the same mistake. It was evident that there was a connection, whether supernatural or psychological, that could take my entire family to rock bottom. That's when my father dragged me, almost by force, to his church. I participated in some services. I didn't feel exactly comfortable, but I noticed that the environment of people praying and singing sincerely had a calming effect. I told everything to the pastor, including the things I did to try to get easy money and health for my mother. I don't know if he believed every detail, but he listened without criticizing. The pastor said, You must pray, ask for forgiveness, and reclaim your dignity. He invited me to participate in a support group where people talked about personal problems and sought solutions in Bible passages. I ended up accepting. In the first meetings, I just stayed quiet, observing men and women telling stories of losses, debts, betrayals, illnesses. I heard each one talk about their pains and saw how everyone tried to support each other. It wasn't my environment, but I decided to give it a chance. At the time, Claire also encouraged me, saying she saw nothing wrong with receiving support as long as I didn't abandon my maturity and critical spirit. Little by little, I let go of those obscure rituals I performed in search of easy solutions. I got rid of the witchcraft books I had accumulated and deleted my registrations on strange websites. I felt a little orphaned without that power that I thought I had at my disposal before. At the same time, I felt that life was less confusing. I got a temporary job at a small logistics company and paid off the overdue bills with some sacrifice. I also got closer to my son and Lydia again. We didn't get back together, but we maintained a friendly relationship. My mother improved slowly without new scares, and today lives with Claire, who takes care of her with love and patience. If you ask me if I regret having resorted to pacts, I say yes and no. Yes, because it brought me an absurd amount of fear and suffering. No, because it perhaps saved my mother and my son from something worse. But I don't advise anyone to repeat what I did, because everything has a cost. Sometimes I think that coincidences may have been interpreted as supernatural intervention. But I don't deny that I felt forces that I don't control. Over time, I learned that whether in the formal religious path or in other forms of faith, what keeps us standing is our courage to face reality. Looking for dangerous shortcuts only makes the burden heavier. Currently, I live in a simple way, working at an electronics store, paying rent on time. I'm not absolutely certain that I'm free from what I invoked. Occasionally, I dream of that male figure, but I no longer feel the same anguish. It may be just the fruit of my confused mind, or it may be something beyond what I understand. In any case, today I count on the support of family and good people. I'm far from having a perfect life, but if I had to give advice to someone who feels seduced by the idea of pacts, I would say, before delivering your soul, exhaust all options. The bill always comes in the end. I learned a lot about myself and about how we cannot ignore the consequences of each step. Whether the supernatural exists or not, I still don't know. But I know that we humans are capable of extreme acts when desperation hits. Good evening. My name is Hannah. I'm about to share something that happened over several years. Something that completely changed my view of the world and the people around me. It might seem exaggerated or made up, but I'm going to tell everything exactly as I remember it, without embellishments or any intention to create a spectacular story. What happened unfolded in situations that could have gone unnoticed by anyone on the outside. But for me, each detail was a step toward an abyss I never thought I'd face. I grew up in a typical middle-class family in a small town near Portland, Oregon. My parents always worked hard to ensure I received a good education and as comfortable a life as possible. When I turned 18 in the summer of 2008, I started looking for a job to help with household expenses. Shortly after, I found something at a small law office downtown. It was during this time that I met Ethan, my first love. He also worked in the same building, but for a different company. Our conversations began casually during lunch breaks and soon became regular. Ethan had a gentle way of approaching me. He'd talk about movies he enjoyed watching, ask about my day, and offer me coffee whenever we ran into each other in the lobby. Over time, we discovered common interests. He loved folk music and said he had a guitar gathering dust because he never found time to practice. I, on the other hand, was always complaining about the hustle of life and how nice it would be to have more hours in the day to do things we enjoyed. After a few months, we started dating. Nothing planned. One day when we were sitting on a bench outside the building, he looked at me in a special way and shyly asked if I wanted to go out with him over the weekend. I agreed without hesitation. That's where everything fell into place naturally. In less than a year, we were already talking about living together, saving money, and maybe getting married after stabilizing our finances. Eventually, we had a simple wedding at the courthouse with friend witnesses and a small family brunch afterward. The happiness in those first years was genuine. Ethan worked hard to give me peace of mind, and I tried to reciprocate by supporting him in every dream. When I got pregnant for the first time, we received the news as a blessing. Our daughter, Olivia, was born healthy and filled us with joy. I remember how my husband held his daughter in his arms for the first time and was so emotional he could barely speak. The kind of scene that makes you believe life is truly worth living. The following months were hectic: diapers, sleepless nights, and the routine of someone who needs to balance work and family. Even so, Ethan was present. He would wake up in the middle of the night to help me prepare Olivia's bottle. On his days off, he would take the baby for walks and let me rest. We lived with little, but it was a little filled with love. There was nothing I wanted to change in those days. Things started to change 2 years later. Ethan and I were still very close, but he began talking about wanting to change jobs and earn more to buy our own house. I supported him, thinking everything could work out. One morning in late autumn, he left for an interview and kissed me on the forehead, saying he'd come back with good news. That day, he didn't return home. I received a phone call from strangers informing me that he had been in a car accident. They said he lost control and crashed into a barrier on the highway. I arrived at the hospital, not knowing exactly what to expect. Unfortunately, he had already passed away. The days that followed were a whirlwind. I tried to be strong for Olivia, but inside I felt completely lost. My parents helped as much as they could, but the pain was still immense. The feeling of emptiness at night when I looked at the bed and saw his pillow untouched became unbearable. Olivia, who was just over 2 years old at the time, kept asking about her dad, and I tried to explain in the best way I could. I thought that would be the hardest moment of my life, but looking back, I realized I still had strengths I didn't know about, and they would be necessary for what was to come. Over time, life took its course. Olivia grew up, learned to speak better, adapted to preschool, and developed a caring personality. I dedicated myself to work to ensure our livelihood. Although the pain never disappeared, It took on a milder form, a permanent but manageable longing. I avoided thinking about relationships or rebuilding my romantic life. I focused on being a mother, friend, and professional. Sometimes I felt a kind of guilt when considering getting involved with someone else. I preferred not to think about it. It was around this time, when Olivia was 5, that I met Marcus. He appeared unexpectedly one afternoon when I was picking up Olivia from school. He was standing outside in a uniform that indicated he worked in law enforcement. We exchanged few words about the movement around the school. Apparently, he was doing a preventive patrol. A few days later, I ran into him again at the same place, this time talking to other parents. He recognized me and asked about Olivia, who was playing in the yard. I responded, he smiled, and we struck up a conversation. He told me he was a deputy sheriff who worked in shifts and liked to talk to the community because he believed in prevention as the best way to maintain order. It wasn't long before, after a few more weeks, he took the initiative to invite me for coffee. At first, I hesitated. There was still an emotional burden related to Ethan's memory. But after thinking about it for a while, I accepted. The conversation was pleasant. Marcus had a serene manner and conveyed confidence. He talked about his own family, said he was divorced and never had children. I opened up more than I imagined I would. I told him about losing Ethan. He was understanding, without exaggerating, with easy words of comfort. From that meeting on, we began to see each other with some frequency. Initially, I didn't formally introduce Marcus to Olivia, but she would see him on days when he was patrolling near the school. Gradually, she got used to seeing him. He had a talent for dealing with children. He would ask questions, play guessing games, and bring some candy or chocolate. Nothing ostentatious, but friendly enough that she didn't feel uncomfortable. My mother, upon learning I was dating someone, showed concern at first, fearing I might be rushing things. However, I also noticed she was relieved to see me smiling again. I didn't exactly know what to feel. Part of me felt like I was betraying Ethan's memory, but another part, very tired of loneliness, saw in Marcus a chance to have a more complete life again. That's how, between internal conflicts and small moments of happiness, our relationship solidified. After a year and a half of dating, Marcus proposed to me. We did something very simple, since neither of us liked pomp. Just a ceremony at the courthouse, and a small gathering with family members. My mother and father were present. Olivia, then 6 years old, delivered the rings to us. It was a beautiful scene, although the image of Ethan still pulsed strongly in my mind. Time softens scars, but it doesn't erase what we've lived. Marcus moved into the small apartment where Olivia and I lived. He brought few belongings since he shared his old house with a friend, and didn't mind leaving almost everything there. At first, I felt this gesture represented his willingness to build something new with us. He reorganized Olivia's small room to make it more comfortable, bought a larger cabinet for the kitchen, and installed shelves for my daughter's toys. In the first few months, everything seemed to fit together. Marcus had a more exhausting routine than I had anticipated, but he always said public safety demanded it. Sometimes he'd come home very late smelling of cigarettes or alcohol, but I attributed this to the stressful environment in which he worked. He explained that many colleagues ended their shifts by going to a bar or pub, and he ended up joining them to unwind. I didn't see a problem with this, as long as it didn't become a habit that harmed our relationship. Once I noticed Marcus responding harshly to a neighbor who asked about some noise in the hallway. He, who was previously so polite, seemed impatient. The next day, everything was normal again. I thought maybe it was just stress. Soon after came other small situations that made me uncomfortable, like comments he made about my clothes. Sometimes he'd compliment me. Other times say I was drawing too much attention at work. He started calling me more frequently to know where I was and who I was with. Sometimes I appreciated the care, but other times I felt there was unnecessary control. However, whenever I tried to talk about it, he would become sweet and affectionate again. It was as if there were two sides to Marcus. My daughter, now 7 years old, never complained directly about him. Still, I noticed she had become more withdrawn. I thought it might be a phase. Children can become introverted or anxious, especially when there are changes in the family structure. Marcus tried to be participatory, giving gifts, helping with homework, but I could see something in Olivia's eyes that I couldn't interpret. I thought that with time, she would get completely used to his presence. The arguments between Marcus and me began to emerge subtly. He'd say my work occupied too much of my time, and that I should spend more time at home taking care of my daughter. I argued that I needed to support the household along with him, since his salary fluctuated depending on the side jobs he took. He retorted by saying that I didn't care about Olivia's well-being. Once he raised his voice in such a way that my daughter ran to her room, frightened. He noticed, tried to calm down, and apologized. His controlling behavior intensified gradually. He began to evaluate my personal expenses, wanted to see bank statements, asked why I took so long to get home after work. I tried to dismiss it, believing in the narrative that he was just concerned about our safety. However, the feeling of discomfort grew. It was during this period that I began to have difficulty sleeping. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, not knowing exactly what was tormenting me. I felt something was wrong, but couldn't name the problem. One night, Marcus came home, smelling strongly of alcohol. He said it was a complicated day at the station, and he ended up overdoing it with his colleagues. He was agitated and speaking incoherently. Olivia was asleep, and I asked him to speak more quietly. He didn't like that. He made an aggressive comment about how I always tried to control him. Amid the arguments, he slammed the bedroom door and locked himself in. I stayed in the living room wondering if I wasn't indeed overreacting. On the other hand, an inner voice told me that this wasn't normal. About a month later, things seemed to have calmed down a bit. Marcus stopped coming home late, promised he would drink less, and went back to helping Olivia with her tasks. I was relieved, believing that everything had just been a phase of turbulence. But on a certain Sunday morning, while tidying up the living room cabinet, I found some papers I didn't recognize. They were receipts of deposits that Marcus had made to an unknown recipient. The amounts were large, and the dates were recent. My first reaction was astonishment. Where did that money come from? Before confronting him, I took photos of all those receipts and sent them to my own email, fearing he might discard them. I knew exactly how much he earned, and those amounts far exceeded what we received together. I tried to confront him, but he brushed it off, saying it was a loan to a relative, something he preferred to keep confidential. That answer didn't convince me. I started paying more attention to the stories he told about work. I noticed contradictions. Some nights he claimed to be on duty, but would appear at the apartment in the middle of the night, without the slightest sign of being in uniform. When I asked, he would talk about covert operations or give vague explanations. My uneasiness grew, and I decided to share the situation with a work colleague, Rachel, who listened carefully. She suggested I be careful, because if he was involved in something illegal, my daughter and I could be at risk. I didn't like hearing that, but I appreciated her concern. A few days later, I noticed Olivia was very sad. She didn't want to eat dinner and curled up in bed. I tried to talk to her, but she said she wasn't feeling well. I stayed beside her, told stories, and remained until she fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I got up to drink water and passed by her room. I heard some whispers. I opened the door and saw she was mumbling incoherent things, probably dreaming, but her face was wet with tears. I stroked her hair and covered her better. For the first time, I had a bad feeling, something that made me think of Ethan and how he would have cared for the girl if he were alive. I felt longing and guilt. It was the next morning that my life turned upside down. Before leaving for work, I went to check on Olivia in her room, but she was strangely quiet, sitting in a corner near the window. When she saw me, she started crying. I held her hands and asked what was happening. Then she confessed something I never wanted to hear. She said Marcus made her feel uncomfortable, that he had touched her in a way that scared her. She spoke of veiled threats, of comments she couldn't understand very well, but that terrified her. With each sentence, my heart seemed to stop. "Mom, I didn't want to tell you to not make you sad," she sobbed. I don't clearly remember how I reacted then. I think I screamed, cried, and hugged my daughter all at once. A fury took hold of me, mixed with an uncontrollable fear. I demanded she tell me all the details, but she was embarrassed, confused, with tears streaming down her face. I was overcome with guilt. How had I not noticed anything? How could I have brought a man into my home, sharing the same roof with Olivia? I decided I couldn't stay in that residence for one more day. I gathered some clothes, documents, and whatever was essential. I thought about calling the police, but this option caused me panic. He was a law enforcement officer, after all. On impulse, I called my mother and asked if she could take us in. She lived not too far away, but distant enough that Marcus wouldn't easily find us. My mother didn't hesitate, saying we should come immediately. I knew that after that discovery, any confrontation with Marcus could be dangerous. He might deny everything or, worse, become aggressive, and I wouldn't risk Olivia's safety. We left the house within minutes, without leaving a note or explanation. When we arrived at my mother's house, she realized something serious had happened. I told her everything, although with great difficulty. She was shocked, repeating that this was unbelievable. Olivia stayed in the room, hugging a stuffed animal, quiet, staring into space. I called work and vaguely explained that I would need a few days off due to a serious family problem. I got emergency leave. During the first 24 hours, I felt numb. I would cry and then get angry, wanting to do something extreme. Part of me wanted to go back to the apartment, confront Marcus, scream that he was a monster. Another part feared his reaction and what it could cause me or my daughter. My mother suggested reporting him formally. I agreed, but at the same time, my daughter begged me amid sobs. "I don't want to talk about this with anyone, Mom. I'm afraid." The feeling of helplessness was devastating. I wanted justice, but wasn't sure how to proceed. I decided to think better the next day. We needed time to process everything. Marcus showed up at the apartment that same night, according to a neighbor who was my friend. He knocked on the door, called for me, tried to call me, but my phone was on silent. The next day, I received various confusing messages on my cell phone, questions about where I was, statements that he had something to explain to me, declarations of love, subtle threats. I was frightened by that abrupt change in tone. My mother, concerned about our safety, suggested I go talk to a woman in the neighborhood known for helping people with family problems. She wasn't a psychologist, but a sort of lady who gave advice, blessings, and things like that. Mrs. Alina was her name. I went to her house despite my skepticism. She received me in a small room full of paintings and images I can't name. She listened to my story attentively. I didn't mention the sordid details, just said that my husband did bad things and that my daughter and I were afraid. Mrs. Alina held my hand and said that evil, when committed, turns against its own author. She said that human justice doesn't always work as it should, but that everyone reaps what they sow. I didn't exactly find comfort in that, but I felt minimally supported. In the following days, I sought help at a women's support center. I told my story this time with more clarity, although still without using all the details that Olivia had revealed. The counselors were very helpful. They explained how reporting works in cases of violence and abuse. I was afraid of Marcus's reaction if he knew I was telling everything. But on the other hand, I realized I couldn't cower. I needed to protect Olivia. I arranged with the professionals that I would return there with my daughter, so she could talk to someone specialized if she was prepared. During this interval, Marcus continued sending messages, calling incessantly, going to my workplace. My colleague Rachel, who knew about the case, told me he would show up there asking if I had left any message. She always changed the subject and warned me, "He's very nervous. Be careful." My mother insisted I go to the police station, but there was a detail that paralyzed me. Marcus had contacts in the police force. I feared he could manipulate the process or use his influence to distort the facts. Even so, I finally gathered courage and went. I filed a report, said my daughter, and I needed protection, talked about his conduct. I didn't delve into the abuse issues, but emphasized that he was morally harassing us. The clerk seemed attentive, but at no time did I feel much confidence. He advised me to seek the family court if I wanted any protective measure for me and my daughter. I followed the advice and formally requested this measure, although they explained that everything would depend on the evidence and the progress of the investigation. Even insecure, I knew that was the first step. The response came in a way I didn't expect. While I was trying to deal with this dilemma, news appeared about an internal investigation into corruption in the sheriff's department. The story talked about schemes of extortion and bribes. At first, I didn't associate it with Marcus, but after a few weeks, a list of names involved came out, and there was his. According to the allegations, several officers were receiving money from merchants, and even people linked to illicit activities. Those receipts I found in the cabinet now made sense. Within a few weeks, officers began to be detained. I saw images of Marcus being escorted to an official vehicle, his expression heavy. My heart had a strange reaction. In part, I felt relieved at no longer having to fear him knocking at my door. In part, I felt a deep indignation when remembering everything he had done to my daughter. I was called to testify about what I knew. I reported only that he came home with money whose origin I didn't know, that he maintained suspicious contacts and made substantial deposits. I did not directly mention Olivia's abuse, since the priority was to keep her protected. I didn't know if I was acting right or wrong, but I was afraid of exposing her to a complex process without being sure she could bear to retell everything. However, to my surprise, the abuse issue came up indirectly. Other testimonies emerged involving serious behaviors by Marcus, including involvement with minors. This devastated me, but at the same time gave me strength to see that many other victims might be keeping silent. That's when I made my decision. My daughter and I would tell our part to the authorities, but in a protected manner, with the help of a psychologist who worked with children. It would be the only way to end that cycle of silence. The session in which Olivia spoke was conducted in a specialized environment, away from spotlights and without Marcus's presence. She told bit by bit, with much crying, the gestures and words he had used. It was a painful report to hear, but also essential for me to understand the dimension of what he had done. The authorities were shocked and promised to take this forward. The prosecutor responsible for the investigation included Olivia's testimony in the body of evidence. Although I feared reprisals, I learned through my lawyer that Marcus would remain in custody at least until the trial due to the seriousness of the corruption charges and other crimes. I prayed it would stay that way. In the following months, I followed the evolution of the process, always supported by the team. It was a period of mental exhaustion. I needed to return to work, take care of Olivia, try to resume a routine. My mother offered all possible help, staying with my daughter when I needed to go out. The little girl, now almost 8 years old, had frequent nightmares. I sought a therapist specialized in trauma to accompany her. The professional explained that the healing process is long and requires patience. She said there was no problem in talking again about the biological father, Ethan, because he represented a positive figure in Olivia's memory. This could give her a reference of love and care. I recovered little by little. Working distracted me, and seeing Olivia resume small joys, drawing, watching cartoons, playing with her grandmother, brought me hope, even though the feeling of guilt for what happened never completely went away. I tried not to drown in self-recrimination. Marcus's trial took more than a year to happen. During this period, numerous pieces of evidence emerged that he and other officers were taking advantage of their positions to threaten people who had no means to defend themselves. The scheme involved everything from small extortions to facilitating smuggling in exchange for bribes. As for the abuse of minors, This came to light in a shocking way and made much of the public opinion demand exemplary punishment. There were moments when I thought, if it weren't for this investigation, he might still be free and I living in the dark. On the day I was summoned to testify in court, my anxiety was at maximum. I entered the courtroom with my head held high, but inside I was trembling. I told how I met Marcus, how he won my trust, and explained that I decided to report him only after being sure of what was happening with my daughter. I talked about the suspicious money and his controlling temperament. I didn't look at him once. When the defense attorney tried to disqualify me, as if I wanted to take some financial benefit, the prosecutor countered by presenting the evidence from the investigation and Olivia's recorded testimony, protected by confidentiality and accompanied by professionals. I left the court with a mix of relief and tiredness. A few days later, the sentence came, several years of imprisonment for Marcus, without the possibility of appealing while free. The news reached me by phone. I felt my legs fail. I sat down and cried. It wasn't a celebration, but a discharge of everything I had suffered. When I told Olivia that he could no longer get close to her, she smiled timidly, like someone recovering a bit of tranquility. I thought from there everything would be fine. But in the first months after the conviction, I began to notice strange signs in my mother's house. Doors that were left open even when we were sure they were closed. Objects that disappeared and reappeared in unusual places. My mother said it was all in my head, that maybe I was stressed. But it bothered me enough that I started leaving lights on at night. It wasn't exactly a fear of something supernatural. It was a feeling of insecurity. What if someone connected to Marcus tried to persecute us or take revenge? I didn't sleep well, always with the impression that there was something that didn't fit. This disturbance intensified when Olivia mentioned having seen a man standing on the sidewalk in front of her grandmother's house. She told me this naturally, saying the man just stood observing but didn't try to talk to her. I asked what he looked like, and she couldn't describe him very well, but made it clear he didn't seem to be Marcus or anyone known. My mother later caught a glimpse of a similar silhouette, but thought it might be some resident of the region. Still, the fear of retaliation left me distressed. It could be any curious person or someone connected to him. I tried not to give much importance, but I remained alert. In parallel, Mrs. Alina called me for a conversation. She said she had felt something different in the environment when she passed in front of my mother's house. She spoke enigmatically that when a person carries a lot of pain and anger, other energies can take advantage to keep themselves alive. I made it clear that I didn't believe much in these things. She just said, "Take care of your heart. If you need help, I'm here." Although I avoided believing in something beyond what I could see, it was impossible to ignore that the sequence of events had left us fragile, and that somehow all this could be reflecting on our mental health. That's when I had a series of dreams that left me restless. In all of them appeared a presence that I couldn't see clearly, but I knew was there. I tried to talk to it, but received no response. I would wake up breathless and wonder if I wasn't developing some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. There wasn't a specific episode that sealed the end of these events. Gradually, they diminished. I managed to return to my apartment after a simple renovation and a change of furniture. I was exhausted but determined to resume life. Olivia was nearly 9 years old now, but willing, returning to school full-time. She still talked now and then about the nightmares she had, but she seemed to deal with them better than I did. The truth is that even without explicit phenomena, I never felt completely free from fears again. Any knock on the door, any unknown call, still made me think of Marcus or the possibility that something bad could return. It was a long adaptation process in which I relied on therapy and the affection of my family. I learned that it is not possible to erase the past, but that we can try to transform our memories into tools of protection and maturation. Today I write all this with the intention of moving forward. Olivia is healthy, growing up, and no longer shows so much fear. I maintain contact with a support network for women who have gone through abusive relationships. I am far from being a person who has resolved everything, but I believe my story can somehow alert other mothers to pay more attention to the signs their children give. I am not the same Hannah as before. I lost part of my innocence and discovered that blindly trusting can have painful consequences. But if there's something that remained intact, it's my love for life. As much as there have been threats, pains, and even events that I couldn't completely explain, I refuse to let myself be dominated by the darkness of the past. I thank each day I spend with my daughter, aware that although terror exists in various forms, we can always find ways to overcome it, even if it requires all our courage. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.